Chapter 1. Forgetting of Proper Names. During the year 1898, I published a short essay on the psychic mechanism of forgetfulness. I shall now repeat its content, and take it as a starting point for further discussion. I have there undertaken a psychologic analysis of a common case of temporary forgetfulness of proper names, and from a pregnant example of my own observation, I have reached the conclusion that this frequent and practically unimportant occurrence of a failure of a psychic function of memory admits an explanation which goes beyond the customary utilization of this phenomenon. If an average psychologist should be asked to explain how it happens that we often fail to recall a name which we are sure we know, he would probably content himself with the answer that proper names are more apt to be forgotten than any other content of memory. He might give plausible reasons for this forgetting preference for proper names, but he would not assume any deep determinant for the process. I was led to examine exhaustively the phenomenon of temporary forgetfulness through the observation of certain peculiarities, which, although not general, can nevertheless be seen clearly in some cases. In these there is not only forgetfulness, but also false recollection. He who strives for the escaped name brings to consciousness others, substitutive names, which, although immediately recognized as false, nevertheless obtrude themselves with great tenacity. The process which should lead to the reproduction of the lost name is, as it were, displaced, and thus brings one to an incorrect substitute. Now it is my assumption that the displacement is not left to psychic arbitrariness, but that it follows lawful and rational paths. In other words, I assume that the substitutive name or names stand in direct relation to the lost name, and I hope, if I succeed in demonstrating this connection, to throw light on the origin of the forgetting of names. In the example which I selected for analysis in 1898, I vainly strove to recall the name of the master who made the imposing frescoes of the Last Judgment in the dome of Orvieto. Instead of the lost name Signorelli, two other names of artists, Botticelli and Boltraffio, obtruded themselves, names which my judgment immediately and definitely rejected as being incorrect. When the correct name was imparted to me by an outsider, I recognized it at once, without any hesitation. The examination of the influence and association paths which caused the displacement from Signorelli to Botticelli and Boltraffio led to the following results. A. The reason for the escape of the name Signorelli is neither to be sought in the strangeness in itself of this name, nor in the psychologic character of the connection in which it was inserted. The forgotten name was just as familiar to me as any of the substitutive names, Botticelli, and somewhat more familiar than the other substitute, Boltraffio, of the possessor of which I could hardly say more than that he belonged to the Milanese school. The connection, too, in which the forgetting of the name took place appeared to me harmless, and had no further explanation. I journeyed by carriage with a stranger from Ragusa, Dalmatia, to a station in Herzegovina. Our conversation drifted to traveling in Italy, and I asked my companion whether he had been in Orvieto and had seen there the famous frescoes of B. The forgetting of the name could not be explained until after I had recalled the theme discussed immediately before this conversation. This forgetting then made itself known as a disturbance of the newly emerging theme caused by the theme preceding it. In brief, before I asked my traveling companion if he had been in Orvieto, we had been discussing the customs of the Turks living in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I had related what I heard from a colleague who was practicing medicine among them, namely, that they show full confidence in the physician and complete submission to fate. When one is compelled to inform them that there is no help for the patient, they answer, "Sir, Herr, what can I say? I know that if he could be saved, you would save him." In these sentences alone we can find the words and names Bosnia, Herzegovina, Herr, Sir, which may be inserted in an association series between Signorelli, Botticelli, and Boltraffio. C. I assume that the stream of thoughts concerning the customs of the Turks in Bosnia, etc., was able to disturb the next thought because I withdrew my attention from it before it came to an end. For I recalled that I wished to relate a second anecdote which was next to the first in my memory. These Turks value the sexual pleasure above all else, and at sexual disturbance merge into an utter despair, which strangely contrasts with their resignation at the peril of losing their lives. One of my colleague's patients once told him, "For you know, Sir, Herr, if that ceases, life no longer has any charm." I refrained from imparting this characteristic feature, because I did not wish to touch upon such a delicate theme in conversation with a stranger. But I went still further. I also deflected my attention from the continuation of the thought, which might have associated itself in me with the theme, death and sexuality. It was at that time under the after effects of a message which I had received a few weeks before, during a brief sojourn in Trafoi. A patient on whom I had spent much effort had ended his life on account of an incurable sexual disturbance. I know positively that this sad event, and everything connected with it, did not come to my conscious recollection on that trip in Herzegovina. However, the agreement between Trafoi and Boltraffio forces me to assume that this reminiscence was at that time brought to activity despite all the intentional deviation of my attention. D. I can no longer conceive the forgetting of the name Signorelli as an accidental occurrence. I must recognize in this process the influence of a motive. There are motives which actuated the interruption in the communication of my thoughts concerning the customs of the Turks, etc., and which later influenced me to exclude from my consciousness the thought connected with them, and which might have led to the message concerning the incident in Trafoi. That is, I wanted to forget something, I repressed something. To be sure, I wished to forget something other than the name of the master of Orvieto, but this other thought brought about an associative connection between itself and this name, so that my act of volition missed the aim, and I forgot the one against my will, while I intentionally wished to forget the other. The disinclination to recall directed itself against the one content. The inability to remember appeared in another. The case would have been obviously simpler if this disinclination and the inability to remember had concerned the same content. The substitutive names no longer seem so thoroughly justified as they were before this explanation. They remind me, after the form of a compromise, as much of what I wished to forget as of what I wished to remember, and show me that my object to forget something was neither a perfect success nor a failure. E. The nature of the association formed between the lost name and the repressed theme, death and sexuality, etc., containing the names of Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Trafoi, is also very strange. In the scheme inserted here, which originally appeared in 1898, an attempt is made to graphically represent these associations. The name Signorelli was thus divided into two parts. One pair of syllables, Elli, returned unchanged in one of the substitutions, while the other had gained, through the translation of Signor, Sir, Herr, many and diverse relations to the name contained in the repressed theme, but was lost through it in the reproduction. Its substitution was formed in a way to suggest that a displacement took place along the same associations, Herzegovina and Bosnia, regardless of the sense and acoustic demarcation. The names were therefore treated in this process like the pictures of a sentence which is to be transformed into a picture puzzle or rebus. No information was given to consciousness concerning the whole process, which instead of the name Signorelli was thus changed to the substitutive names. At first sight no relation is apparent between the theme that contained the name Signorelli and the repressed one which immediately preceded it. I'll now describe the graphic. The word Signorelli is at the top left. The Signor portion is in a box. One line leads from that Signor to the word Herzegovina, where the her is in a box, and another line from Signor leads to Herr, as in Sir, what can I say? That has a line leading to the topic death and sexuality. That has a line leading to repressed thoughts. In the middle of the graph is the word Botticelli with the B-O in a circle. Down from that is a line leading to the word Bosnia with the B-O in a circle. To the right of that is the word Boltrafio with the B-O in a circle. Back to the repressed thoughts, a line leading to the right comes to the word Trafoi, and Trafoi has a line leading to Trafio, the end of Botrafio. That's the graph. Perhaps it is not superfluous to remark that the given explanation does not contradict the conditions of memory reproduction and forgetting assumed by other psychologists, which they seek in certain relations and dispositions. Only in certain cases have we added another motive to the factors long recognized as causative in forgetting names, and have thus bared the mechanisms of faulty memory. The assumed dispositions are indispensable also in our case, in order to make it possible for the repressed element to associatively gain control over the desired name and take it along into the repression. Perhaps this would not have occurred in another name having more favorable conditions of reproduction, for it is quite probable that a suppressed element continually strives to assert itself in some other way, but attains this success only where it meets with suitable conditions. At other times the suppression succeeds without disturbance of function, or, as we may justly say, without symptoms. When we recapitulate the conditions for forgetting a name with faulty recollection, we find: 1. A certain disposition to forget the name. 2. A process of suppression which has taken place shortly before. And 3. The possibility of establishing an outer association between the concerned name and the element previously suppressed. The last condition will probably not have to be much overrated, for the slightest claim on the association is apt in most cases to bring it about. But it is a different and further reaching question whether such outer association can really furnish the proper condition to enable the suppressed element to disturb the reproduction of the desired name, or whether after all a more intimate connection between the two themes is not necessarily required. On superficial consideration, one may be willing to reject the latter requirement and consider the temporal meeting in perfectly dissimilar contents as sufficient. But on more thorough examination one finds more and more frequently that the two elements, the repressed and the new one, connected by an outer association, possess besides a connection in content, and this can also be demonstrated in the example Signorelli. The value of the understanding gained through the analysis of the example Signorelli naturally depends on whether we must explain this case as a typical or as an isolated process. I must now maintain that the forgetting of a name associated with faulty recollection uncommonly often follows the same process as was demonstrated in the case of Signorelli. Almost every time that I observed the phenomenon in myself, I was able to explain it in the manner indicated above as being motivated by repression. I must mention still another viewpoint in favor of the typical nature of our analysis. I believe that one is not justified in separating the cases of name forgetting with faulty recollection from those in which incorrect substitutive names have not obtruded themselves. These substitutive names occur spontaneously in a number of cases. In other cases, where they do not come spontaneously, they can be brought to the surface by concentration of attention, and they then show the same relation to the repressed element and the lost name as those that come spontaneously. Two factors seem to play a part in bringing to consciousness the substitutive names. First, the effort of attention, and second, the inner determinant which adheres to the psychic material. I could find the latter in the greater or lesser facility which forms the required outer association between the two elements. A great many of the cases of name forgetting without faulty recollection therefore belong to the cases with substitutive name formation, the mechanism of which corresponds to the one in the example Signorelli. But I surely shall not venture to assert that all cases of name forgetting belong to the same group. There is no doubt that there are cases of name forgetting that proceed in a much simpler way. We shall represent this state of affairs carefully enough if we assert that besides the simple forgetting of proper names, there is another forgetting which is motivated by repression. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Forgetting of Foreign Words. The ordinary vocabulary of our own language seems to be protected against forgetting within the limits of normal function, but it is quite different with words from a foreign language. The tendency to forget such words extends to all parts of speech. In fact, depending on our own general state and the degree of fatigue, the first manifestation of functional disturbances evinces itself in the irregularity of our control over foreign vocabulary. In a series of cases, this forgetting follows the same mechanism as the one revealed in the example Signorelli. As a demonstration of this, I shall report a single analysis, characterized, however, by valuable features, concerning the forgetting of a word, not a noun, from the Latin quotation. Before proceeding, allow me to give a full and clear account of this little episode. Last summer, while journeying on my vacation, I renewed the acquaintance of a young man of academic education, who, as I soon noticed, was conversant with some of my works. In our conversation we drifted, I no longer remember how, to the social position of the race to which we both belonged. He, being ambitious, bemoaned the fact that his generation, as he expressed it, was destined to grow crippled, that it was prevented from developing its talents and from gratifying its desires. He concluded his passionately felt speech with a familiar verse from Virgil, Exoriare, in which the unhappy Dido leaves her vengeance upon Aeneas to posterity. Instead of concluded, I should have said wished to conclude, for he could not bring the quotation to an end, and attempted to conceal the open gap in his memory by transposing the words, Exoriare ex nostris ossibus ultor. He finally became piqued, and said, "Please don't make such a mocking face, as if you were gloating over my embarrassment, but help me. There is something missing in this verse. How does it read in its complete form?" "With pleasure," I answered, and cited it correctly, Exoriare aliquis nostris est oxibus ultor. "It is too stupid to forget such a word," he said. "By the way, I understand you claim that forgetting is not without its reasons. I should be very curious to find out how I came to forget this indefinite pronoun aliquis." I gladly accepted the challenge, as I hoped to get an addition to my collection, and said, "We can easily do this, but I must ask you to tell me frankly and without any criticism everything that occurs to your mind after you focus your attention, without any particular intention, on the forgotten word." Very well. The ridiculous idea comes to me to divide the word in the following way: a and liquis. What does that mean? I don't know. What else does that recall to you? The thought goes on to reliques, liquidation, liquidity, fluid. Does that mean anything to you now? No, not by a long shot. Just go ahead. I now think, he said, laughing sarcastically, of Simon of Trent, whose relics I saw 2 years ago in a church in Trent. I think of the old accusation which has been brought against the Jews again, and of the work of Kleinpaul, who sees in these supposed sacrifices reincarnations or revivals, so to speak, of the Saviour. This stream of thought has some connection with the theme which we discussed before the Latin word escaped you. You are right. I now think of an article in an Italian journal which I have recently read. I believe it was entitled, "What St. Augustine Said Concerning Women." What can you do with this? I waited. Now I think of something which surely has no connection with the theme. Oh, please abstain from all criticism, and, oh, I know, I recall a handsome old gentleman whom I met on my journey last week. He was really an original type. He looked like a big bird of prey. His name, if you care to know, is Benedict. Well, at least you give a grouping of saints and church fathers: Saint Simon, Saint Augustine, Saint Benedict. I believe that there was a church father named Origenes. 3 of these, moreover, are Christian names, like Paul in the name Kleinpaul. Now I think of Saint Januarius and the blood miracle. I find that the thoughts are running mechanically. Just stop a moment. Both Saint Januarius and Saint Augustine have something to do with the calendar. Will you recall to me the blood miracle? Don't you know about it? The blood of Saint Januarius is preserved in a phial in a church in Naples, and on a certain holiday a miracle takes place causing it to liquefy. The people think a great deal of this miracle, and become very excited if the liquefying process is retarded, as happened once during the French occupation. The general in command, or Garibaldi if I am not mistaken, then took the priest aside, and with a very significant gesture pointed out to him the soldiers arrayed without, and expressed his hope that the miracle would soon take place. And it actually took place. Well, what else comes to mind? Why do you hesitate? Something really occurred to me, but it is too intimate a matter to impart. Besides, I see no connection and no necessity for telling it. I will take care of the connection. Of course, I cannot compel you to reveal what is disagreeable to you, but then you should not have demanded that I tell you why you forgot the word aliquis. Really? Do you think so? Well, I suddenly thought of a woman from whom I could easily get a message that would be very annoying to us both. That she missed her courses? How could you guess such a thing? That was not very difficult. You prepared me for it long enough. Just think of the saints of the calendar, the liquefying of the blood on a certain day, the excitement if the event does not take place, and the distinct threat that the miracle must take place. Indeed, you have elaborated the miracle of Saint Januarius into a clever allusion to the courses of the woman. It was surely without my knowledge. And do you really believe that my inability to produce the word aliquis was due to this anxious expectation? That appears to be absolutely certain. Don't you recall dividing it into a liquis, and the associations, reliques, liquidation, fluid? Shall I also add to the connection the fact that Saint Simon, to whom you got by way of the reliques, was sacrificed as a child? Please stop. I hope you do not take these thoughts, if I really entertain them, seriously. I will, however, confess to you that the lady is Italian, and that I visited Naples in her company. But may not all this be coincidental? I must leave to your own judgment whether you can explain all these connections through the assumption of coincidence. I will tell you, however, that every similar case that you analyze will lead you to just such remarkable coincidences. I have more than one reason for valuing this little analysis, for which I am indebted to my traveling companion. First, because in this case I was able to make use of a source which is otherwise inaccessible to me. Most of the examples of psychic disturbances of daily life that I have here compiled I was obliged to take from observation of myself. I endeavored to evade the far richer material furnished me by my neurotic patients, because I had to preclude the objection that the phenomena in question were only the result and manifestation of the neurosis. It was therefore of special value for my purpose to have a stranger free from a neurosis offer himself as a subject for such examination. This analysis is also important in other respects, inasmuch as it elucidates a case of word forgetting without substitutive recollection, and this confirms the principle formulated above, namely, that the appearance or non-appearance of incorrect substitutive recollections does not constitute an essential distinction. But the principal value of the example aliquis lies in another of its distinctions from the case of Signorelli. In the latter example, the reproduction of the name becomes disturbed through the after effects of a stream of thought which began shortly before and was interrupted, but whose content had no distinct relation to the new theme which contained the name Signorelli. Between the repression and the theme of the forgotten name there existed only the relation of temporal contiguity, which reached the other in order that the two should be able to form a connection through an outer association. On the other hand, in the example aliquis, one can note no trace of such an independent repressed theme, which could occupy conscious thought immediately before and then re-echo as a disturbance. The disturbance of the reproduction proceeded here from the inner part of the theme touched upon, and was brought about by the fact that unconsciously a contradiction arose against the wish idea represented in the quotation. The origin must be construed in the following manner. The speaker deplored the fact that the present generation of his people were being deprived of its rights, and like Dido he presaged that a new generation would take upon itself vengeance against the oppressors. He therefore expressed the wish for posterity. In this moment he was interrupted by the contradictory thought, "Do you really wish so much for posterity? That is not true. Just think in what a predicament you would be if you should now receive the information that you must expect posterity from the quarter you have in mind. No, you want no posterity, as much as you need it for your vengeance." This contradiction asserts itself, just as the example Signorelli, by forming an outer association within one of his ideation elements, and an element of the repressed wish. But here it is brought about in a most strained manner, through what seems an artificial detour of associations. Another important agreement with the example Signorelli results from the fact that the contradiction originates from repressed sources and emanates from thoughts which would cause a deviation of attention. So much for the diversity and interrelationship of both paradigms of the forgetting of names. We have learned to know a second mechanism of forgetting, namely, the disturbance of thought through an inner contradiction emanating from the repression. In the course of this discussion, we shall repeatedly meet with this process, which seems to me to be the more easily understood. Footnote. Finer observation reduces somewhat the contrast between the analyses of Signorelli and aliquis, as far as the substitutive recollections are concerned. Here, too, the forgetting seems to be accompanied by substitutive formations. When I later asked my companion whether in his effort to recall the forgotten word he did not think of some substitution, he informed me that he was at first tempted to put an ob into the verse, nostris ob ossibus, perhaps the disjointed part of a liquis, and that later the word exoriare obtruded itself with particular distinctness and persistency. Being skeptical, he added that it was apparently due to the fact that it was the first word of the verse. But when I asked him to focus his attention on the associations to exoriare, he gave me the word exorcism. This makes me think that the reinforcement of exoriare in the reproduction was really the value of such substitution. It probably came through the association exorcism from the names of the saints. However, those are refinements upon which no value need be laid. It seems now quite possible that the appearance of any kind of substitutive recollection is a constant sign, perhaps only characteristic and misleading, of the purposive forgetting motivated by repression. This substitution might also exist in the reinforcement of an element akin to the thing forgotten, even where incorrect substitutive names fail to appear. Thus, in the example of Signorelli, as long as the name of the painter remained inaccessible to me, I had more than a clear visual image of the cycle of his frescoes, and of the picture of himself in the corner. At least it was more intensive than any of my other visual memory traces. In another case, also reported in my essay in 1898, I had hopelessly forgotten the street name and address connected with a disagreeable visit in a strange city, but, as if to mock me, the house number appeared especially vivid, whereas the memory of numbers usually causes me the greatest difficulty. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. Forgetting of Names and Order of Words. Experiences like those mentioned concerning the process of forgetting a part of the order of words from a foreign language may cause one to wonder whether the forgetting of the order of words in one's own language requires an essentially different explanation. To be sure, one is not wont to be surprised that after a while a formula or poem learned by heart can only be reproduced imperfectly, with variations and gaps. Still, as this forgetting does not affect equally all the things learned together, but seems to pick out therefrom definite parts, it may be worth our effort to investigate analytically some examples of such faulty reproductions. Brill reports the following example. While conversing one day with a very brilliant young woman, she had occasion to quote from Keats. The poem was entitled Ode to Apollo, and she recited the following lines. In thy western house of gold, where thou livest in thy state, bards that once sublimely told prosaic truths that come too late. She hesitated many times during the recitation, being sure that there was something wrong with the last line. To her surprise, on referring to the book, she found that not only was the last line misquoted, but that there were many other mistakes. The correct lines read as follows. Ode to Apollo. In thy western halls of gold, when thou sittest in thy state, bards that erst sublimely told heroic deeds and sang of fate. The words italicized, emphasized, are those that have been forgotten and replaced by others during the recitation. She was astonished at her many mistakes, and attributed them to failure of memory. I could readily convince her, however, that there was no qualitative or quantitative disturbance of memory in her case, and recalled to her our conversation immediately before quoting these lines. We were discussing the overestimation of personality among lovers, and she thought it was Victor Hugo who said that love is the greatest thing in the world because it makes an angel or a god out of a grocery clerk. She continued, only when we are in love have we blind faith in humanity. Everything is perfect, everything is beautiful, and everything is so poetically unreal. Still, it is a wonderful experience, without going through, notwithstanding, the terrible disappointments that usually follow. It puts us on a level with the gods, and incites us to all sorts of artistic activities. We become real poets. We not only memorize and quote poetry, but we often become Apollos ourselves. She then quoted the lines given above. When I asked on what occasion she memorized the lines, she could not recall. As a teacher of elocution, she was wont to memorize so much and so often that it was difficult to tell just when she had memorized these lines. Judging by the conversation, I suggested, it must seem that this poem is intimately associated with the idea of overestimation of personality of one in love. Have you perhaps memorized this poem when you were in such a state?" She became thoughtful for a while, and soon recalled the following facts. 12 years before, when she was 18 years old, she fell in love. She met the young man while participating in an amateur theatrical performance. He was at the time studying for the stage, and it was predicated that some day he would be a matinee idol. He was endowed with all the attributes needed for such a calling. He was well built, fascinating, impulsive, very clever, and very fickle-minded. She was warned about him, but she paid no heed, attributing it all to the envy of her counselors. Everything went well for a few months, when she suddenly received word that her Apollo, for whom she had memorized these lines, had eloped and married a very wealthy young woman. A few years later she heard that he was living in a Western city, where he was taking care of his father-in-law's interests. The misquoted lines are now quite plain. The discussion about the overestimation of personality among lovers unconsciously recalled to her a disagreeable experience when she herself overestimated the personality of the man she loved. She thought he was a god, but he turned out to be even worse than the average mortal. The episode could not come to the surface because it was determined by very disagreeable and painful thoughts, but the unconscious variations in the poem plainly showed her present mental state. The poetic expressions were not only charged to prosaic ones, but they clearly alluded to the whole episode. Another example of forgetting the order of words of a poem well known to the person I shall cite from Dr. C.G. Jung, quoting words of the author. A man wished to recite the familiar poem, "A pine tree stands alone," etc. In the lines he felt drowsy. He became hopelessly stuck at the words "with the white sheet." This forgetting of such a well-known verse seemed to me rather peculiar, and I therefore asked him to reproduce what came to his mind when he thought of the words "with the white sheet." He gave the following series of associations. The white sheet makes one think of a white sheet on a corpse, a linen sheet with which one covers dead people. Now I think of a near friend. His brother died quite recently. He is supposed to have died of heart disease. He was also very corpulent. My friend is corpulent too, and I thought that he might meet the same fate. Probably he doesn't exercise enough. When I heard of this death I suddenly became frightened. The same thing might happen to me, as my own family is predisposed to obesity. My grandfather died of heart disease. I also am somewhat too corpulent, and for that reason I began an obesity cure a few days ago. Jung remarks, the man had unconsciously immediately identified himself with the pine tree which was covered with a white sheet. For the following example of forgetting the order of words, I am indebted to my friend Dr. Ferenczi of Budapest. Unlike the former examples, it does not refer to a verse taken from poetry, but to a self-coined saying. It may also demonstrate to us the rather unusual case where the forgetting places itself at the disposal of discretion, when the latter is in danger of yielding to a momentary desire. The mistake thus advances to a useful function. After we have sobered down, we justify that inner striving, which at first could manifest itself only by way of inability, as in forgetting or psychic impotence. Quote, at a social gathering someone quoted "Tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner," to which I remarked that the first part of the sentence should suffice, as pardoning is an exemption which must be left to God and the priest. One of the guests thought this observation very good, which in turn emboldened me to remark, probably to ensure myself of the good opinion of the well-disposed critic, that some time ago I thought of something still better, but when I was about to repeat this clever idea, I was unable to recall it. Thereupon I immediately withdrew from the company, and wrote my concealing thoughts. I first recalled the name of the friend who had witnessed the birth of this desired thought, and of the street in Budapest where it took place, and then the name of another friend, whose name was Max, whom we usually called Maxie. That led me to the word maxim, and to the thought that at that time, as in this present case, it was a question of varying a well-known maxim. Strangely enough, I did not recall any maxim but the following sentence God created man in his own image, and its changed conception, man created God in his own image. Immediately I recalled the sought-for recollection. My friend said to me at that time in Andrassy Street, "Nothing human is foreign to me," to which I remarked, basing it on psychoanalytic experience, "You should go further and acknowledge that nothing animal is foreign to you." But after I had finally found the desired recollection, I was even then prevented from telling it in this social gathering. The young wife of the friend whom I had reminded of the animality of the unconscious was also among those present, and I was perforce reminded that she was not at all prepared for the reception of such unsympathetic views. The forgetting spared me a number of unpleasant questions from her and a hopeless discussion, and just that must have been the motive of the temporary amnesia. It is interesting to note that as a concealing thought there emerged a sentence in which the deity is degraded to a human invention, while in the sought-for sentence there was an allusion to the animal in the man. The capitis diminutio is therefore common to both. The whole matter was apparently only a continuation of the stream of thought concerning understanding and forgiving which was stimulated by the discussion. That the desired thought so rapidly appeared may be also due to the fact that I withdrew into a vacant room, away from the society in which it was censored." I have since then analyzed a large number of cases of forgetting or faulty reproduction of the order of words, and the consistent result of these investigations led me to assume that the mechanisms of forgetting, as demonstrated in the examples Aliquis and Ode to Apollo, are almost of universal validity. It is not always very convenient to report such analyses, for just as those cited, they usually lead to intimate and painful things in the person analyzed. I shall therefore add no more to the number of such examples. What is common to all these cases, regardless of the material, is the fact that the forgotten or distorted material becomes connected through some associative road with an unconscious stream of thought which gives rise to the influence that comes to light as forgetting. I am now returning to the forgetting of names, concerning which we have so far considered exhaustively neither the casuistic element nor the motives. As this form of faulty acts can at times be abundantly observed in myself, I am not at a loss for examples. The slight attacks of migraine, from which I am still suffering, are wont to announce themselves hours before through the forgetting of names, and at the height of the attack, during which I am not forced, however, to give up my work, I am often unable to recall all proper names. Still, just such cases as mine may furnish the cause for a strong objection to our analytic efforts. Should not one be forced to conclude from such observations that the causation of the forgetfulness, especially the forgetting of names, is to be sought in circulatory or functional disturbances of the brain, and spare himself the trouble of searching for psychologic explanations for these phenomena? Not at all. That would mean to interchange the mechanism of a process which is the same in all cases, with its variations. But instead of an analysis, I shall cite a comparison, which will settle the argument. Let us assume that I was so reckless as to take a walk at night in an uninhabited neighborhood of a big city, and was attacked and robbed of my watch and purse. At the nearest police station I report the matter in the following words: I was in this or that street, and was there robbed of my watch and purse, by lonesomeness and darkness. Although these words would not express anything that is incorrect, I would nevertheless run the danger of being considered, judging from the wording of this report, as not quite right in the head. To be correct, the state of affairs could only be described by saying that, favored by the lonesomeness of the place and under cover of darkness, I was robbed of my valuables by unknown malefactors. Now then, the state of affairs in forgetting names need not be different. Favored by exhaustion, circulatory disturbances, and intoxication, I am robbed by an unknown psychic force of the disposal over the proper names belonging to my memory. It is the same force which in other cases may bring about the same failure of memory during perfect health and mental capacity. When I analyze these cases of name forgetting occurring in myself, I find almost regularly that the name withheld shows some relation to a theme which concerns my own person, and is apt to provoke in me strong and often painful emotions. Following the convention and commendable practice of the Zurich school, Bleuler, Jung, Ricklin, I might express the same thing in the following form. The name withheld has touched a personal complex in me. The relation of the name to my person is an unexpected one, and is mostly brought about through superficial associations, words of double meaning and of similar sounds. It may generally be designated as a side association. A few simple examples will best illustrate the nature of the same. A patient requested me to recommend to him a sanatorium in the Riviera. I knew of such a place very near Genoa. I also recalled the name of the German colleague who was in charge of the place. But the place itself I could not name, well as I believed I knew it. There was nothing left to do but ask the patient to wait, and to appeal quickly to the women of the family. Just what is the name of the place near Genoa where Dr. X has his small institution, in which Mr. So-and-so remained so long under treatment? Of course you would forget a name like that. The name is nervy. To be sure, I have enough to do with nerves. B. Another patient spoke about a neighboring summer resort, and maintained that besides the two familiar inns there was a third. I disputed the existence of any third inn, and referred to the fact that I had spent 7 summers in the vicinity, and therefore knew more about the place than he. Instigated by my contradiction, he recalled the name. The name of the third inn was the Hawkwartner. Of course I had to admit it. Indeed, I was forced to confess that for 7 summers I had lived near this very inn, whose existence I had so strenuously denied. But why should I have forgotten the name and the object? I believe because the name sounded very much like that of a Vienna colleague who practiced the same specialty as my own. It touched me in my professional complex. C. On another occasion, when about to buy a railroad ticket on the Reichenhall station, I could not recall the very familiar name of the next big railroad station where I had so often passed. I was forced to look it up in the timetable. The name was Rosenheim. I soon discovered through what associations I lost it. An hour earlier I had visited my sister in her home near Reichenhall. My sister's name is Rose, hence also a Rose home. This name was taken away by my family complex. D. This predatory influence of the family complex I can demonstrate in a whole series of complexes. One day I was consulted by a young man, younger brother of one of my female patients, whom I saw any number of times, and whom I used to call by his first name. Later, while wishing to talk about his visit, I forgot his first name, in no way an unusual one, and could not recall it in any way. I walked into the street to read the business signs, and recognized the name as soon as it met my eyes. The analysis showed that I had formed a parallel between the visitor and my own brother, which centered in the question, would my brother in a similar case have behaved like him or even more contrarily? The outer connection between the thoughts concerning the stranger and my own family was rendered possible through the accident that the name of the mothers in each case was the same, Amelia. Subsequently I also understood the substitutive names Daniel and Frank, which obtruded themselves without any explanation. These names, as well as Amelia, belong to Schiller's play The Robbers. They are all connected with the joke of the Vienna pedestrian Daniel Spitzer. E. On another occasion I was unable to find a patient's name which had a certain reference to my early life. The analysis had to be followed over a long devious road before the desired name was discovered. The patient expressed his apprehension lest he should lose his eyesight. This recalled a young man who became blind from a gunshot, and this again led to a picture of another youth who shot himself, and the latter bore the same name as the first patient. though not at all related to him. The name became known to me, however, only after the anxious apprehension from these two juvenile cases was transferred to a person of my own family. Thus an incessant stream of self-reference flows through my thoughts concerning which I usually have no inkling, but which betrays itself through such name-forgetting. It seems as if I were forced to compare with my own person all that I hear about strangers, as if my personal complexes became stirred up at every information from others. It seems impossible that this should be an individual peculiarity of my own person. It must, on the contrary, point to the way we grasp outside matters in general. I have reasons to assume that other individuals meet with experiences quite similar to mine. The best example of this kind was reported to me by a gentleman named Lederer as a personal experience. While on his wedding trip in Venice, he came across a man with whom he was but slightly acquainted, and whom he was obliged to introduce to his wife. As he forgot the name of the stranger, he got himself out of the embarrassment the first time by mumbling the name unintelligibly. But when he met the man a second time, as is inevitable in Venice, he took him aside and begged him to help him out of the difficulty by telling him his name, which he unfortunately had forgotten. The answer of the stranger pointed to a superior knowledge of human nature. "I readily believe that you did not grasp my name. My name is like yours, Lederer." One cannot suppress a slight feeling of unpleasantness on discovering his own name in a stranger. I had recently felt it very plainly when I was consulted during my office hours by a man named S. Freud. However, I am assured by one of my own critics that in this respect he behaves in quite the opposite manner. F. The effect of personal relation can be recognized also in the following examples reported by Jung. Mr. Y. falls in love with a lady who soon thereafter marries Mr. X. In spite of the fact that Mr. Y. was an acquaintance of Mr. X. and had business relations with him, he repeatedly forgot the name, and on a number of occasions, when wishing to correspond with X, he was obliged to ask other people for his name. However, the motivation for the forgetting is more evident in this case than in the preceding ones, which were under the constellation of personal reference. Here the forgetting is manifestly a direct result of the dislike of Y, the happy rival. He does not wish to know anything about him. G. The following case, reported by Ferenczi, the analysis of which is especially instructive through the explanation of substitutive thoughts, like Botticelli-Botrafio for Signorelli, shows in a somewhat different way how self-reference leads to the forgetting of the name. A lady who heard something about psychoanalysis could not recall the name of the psychiatrist, Jung. Instead, the following names occurred to her: K1, a name; Wilde, Nietzsche, Hauptmann. I did not tell her the name, and requested her to repeat her free associations to every thought. To K1 she at once thought of Mrs. K1, that she was an embellished and affected person who looked very well for her age. She does not age. As a general and principal conception of Wilde and Nietzsche, she gave the association mental disease, but then added jocosely, "The Freudians will continue looking for the cases of mental diseases until they themselves become insane." She continued, "I cannot bear Wilde and Nietzsche. I do not understand them. I hear that they were both homosexual. Wilde has occupied himself with young people." Although she muttered in the sentence the correct name, she still did not remember it. To Hauptmann she associated the words half and youth, and only after I called her attention to the word youth did she become aware that she was looking for the name Jung. It is clear that this lady, who had lost her husband at the age of 39 and had no prospect of marrying a second time, had cause enough to avoid reminiscences recalling youth or old age. The remarkable thing is that the concealing thoughts of the desired name came to the surface as simple associations of content, without any sound associations. H. Still different and very finely motivated is an example of name forgetting which the person concerned has himself explained. While taking an examination in philosophy as a minor subject, I was questioned by the examiner about the teachings of Epicurus, and was asked whether I knew who took up his teachings centuries later. I answered that it was Pierre Gassendi, whom 2 days before, while in a café, I had happened to hear spoken of as a follower of Epicurus. To the question how I knew this, I boldly replied that I had taken an interest in Gassendi for a long time. This resulted in a certificate with a magna cum laude, but later, unfortunately, also in a persistent tendency to forget the name Gassendi. I believe that it is due to my guilty conscience that even now I cannot retain this name despite all efforts. I had no business knowing it at that time. To add here another example of forgetting the name of a city, an instance which is perhaps not as simple as those given before, but which will appear credible and valuable to those more familiar with such investigations. The name of an Italian city withdrew itself from memory on account of its far-reaching sound similarity to a woman's first name, which was in turn connected with various emotional reminiscences, which were surely not exhaustively treated in this report. Dr. S. Ferenczi, who observed this case of forgetting in himself, treated it quite justly as an analysis of a dream or an erotic idea. Today I visited some old friends, and the conversation turned to cities of northern Italy. Someone remarked that they still showed the Austrian influence. A few of these cities were cited. I, too, wished to mention one, but the name did not come to me, although I knew that I had spent 2 very pleasant days there. This, of course, does not quite concur with Freud's theory of forgetting. Instead of the desired name of the city, there obtruded themselves the following thoughts: Capua, Brescia, the Lion of Brescia. This lion I saw objectively before me in the form of a marble statue, but I soon noticed that he resembled less the lion of the Statue of Liberty in Brescia, which I saw only in a picture, than the other marble lion which I saw in Lucerne, on the monument in honor of the Swiss Guard fallen in the Tuileries. I finally thought of the desired name. It was Verona. I knew at once the cause of this amnesia, no other than a former servant of the family whom I visited at the time. Her name was Veronica, in Hungarian Verona. I felt a little antipathy for her on account of her repulsive physiognomy, as well as her hoarse, shrill voice and her unbearable self-assertion, to which she felt herself entitled on account of her long service. Also, the tyrannical way in which she treated the children of the family was insufferable to me. Now I knew the significance of the substitutive thoughts. To Capua I immediately associated caput mortuum. I had often compared Veronica's head to a skull. The Hungarian word kapszói, greed after money, surely furnished a determinant for the displacement. Naturally, I also found those more direct associations which connected Capua and Verona as geographical ideas and as Italian words of the same rhythm. The same held true for Brescia. Here, too, I found concealed side tracks of associations of ideas. My antipathy at that time was so violent that I thought Veronica very ugly, and have often expressed my astonishment at the fact that anyone should love her. Why, to kiss her, I said, must provoke nausea. Brescia, at least in Hungary, is very often mentioned not in connection with the lion, but with another wild beast. The most hated name in this country, as well as in North Italy, is that of General Haynau, who is briefly referred to as the hyena of Brescia. From the hated tyrant Haynau, one stream of thought leads over Brescia to the city of Verona, and the other over the idea of the grave-digging animal with the hoarse voice, which corresponds to the thought of a monument to the dead, to the skull, and to the disagreeable organ of Veronica, which was so cruelly insulted in my conscious mind. Veronica in her time ruled as tyrannically as did the Austrian general after the Hungarian and Italian struggles for liberty. Lucerne is associated with the idea of the summer which Veronica spent with her employers in a place nearer Lucerne. The Swiss Guard again recalls that she tyrannized not only the children but also the adult members of the family, and thus played the part of the garde dame. I expressly observe that this antipathy of mine against V consciously belongs to things long overcome. Since that time she has changed in her appearance and manner, very much to her advantage, so that I am able to meet her with sincere regard. To be sure, I hardly find such occasion. As usual, however, my unconscious sticks more tenaciously to those impressions. It is old in its resentment. The Tuileries represent an allusion to a second personality, an old French lady who actually guarded the women of the house, and who was in high regard and somewhat feared by everybody. For a long time I was her élève in French conversation. The word élève recalls that when I visited the brother-in-law of my present host in northern Bohemia, I had to laugh a great deal because the rural population referred to the élèves, pupils, of the School of Forestry as lowen, lions. Also, this jocose recollection might have taken part in the displacement of the hyena by the lion. I. The following example can also show how a personal complex swaying the person at the time being may by devious ways bring about the forgetting of a name. Two men, an elder and a younger, who had traveled together in Sicily 6 months before, exchanged reminiscences of those pleasant and interesting days. "Let's see, what was the name of that place," asked the younger, "where we passed the night before taking the trip to Selinut? Calatafimi, was it not?" The elder rejected this by saying certainly not, but I have forgotten the name too, although I can recall perfectly all the details of the place. Whenever I hear someone forget a name, it immediately produces forgetfulness in me. Let us look for the name. I cannot think of any other names except Caltanissetta, which is surely not correct. "No," said the younger, "the name begins with or contains a W." "But the Italian language contains no W," retorted the older. "I really meant a V, and I said W because I am accustomed to interchange them in my mother tongue." The elder, however, objected to the V. He added, "I believe that I have already forgotten many of the Sicilian names. Suppose we try to find out, for example, what is the name of the place situated on a height which was called Enna in antiquity?" "Oh, I know that, Castrogiovanni." In the next moment the younger man discovered the lost name. He cried out, "Castelvetrano," and was pleased to be able to demonstrate the supposed V. For a moment the elder still lacked the feeling of recognition, but after he accepted the name he was able to state why it had escaped him. He thought, "Obviously because the second half, vetrano, suggests veteran. I am aware that I am not quite anxious to think of aging, and react peculiarly when I am reminded of it. Thus, for example, I had recently reminded a very esteemed friend in most unmistakable terms that he had long ago passed the years of age, because before this he once remarked in the most flattering manner, 'I am no longer a young man.' That my resistance was directed against the second half of the name Castelvetrano is shown by the fact that the initial sound of the same returned in the substitutive name Caltanissetta." "What about the name Caltanissetta itself?" asked the younger. "That also seemed to me like a pet name of a young woman," admitted the elder. Somewhat later he added, "The name for Enna was always only a substitutive name. And now it occurs to me that the name Castrogiovanni, which obtruded itself with the aid of a rationalization, alludes as expressly to Giovanni, young, as the last name Castelvetrano to veteran." The older man believed that he had thus accounted for his forgetting the name. What the motive was that led the young man to this memory failure was not investigated. In some cases one must have recourse to all the fineness of psychoanalytic technique in order to explain the forgetting of a name. Those who wish to read an example of such work, I refer to a communication by Professor E. Jones. I could multiply the examples of name forgetting and prolong the discussion very much further, if I did not wish to avoid elucidating here almost all the viewpoints which will be considered in later themes. I shall, however, take the liberty of comprehending in a few sentences the results of the analyses reported here. The mechanism of forgetting, or rather of losing or temporary forgetting of a name, consists in the disturbance of the intended reproduction of the name through a strange stream of thought unconscious at the time. Between the disturbed name and the disturbing complex there exists a connection, either from the beginning, or such a connection has been formed, perhaps by artificial means, through superficial outer associations. The self-reference complex, personal, family, or professional, proves to be the most effective of the disturbing complexes. A name which, by virtue of its meaning, belongs to a number of thought associations, complexes, is frequently disturbed in its connection to one series of thoughts through a stronger complex belonging to the other associations. To avoid the awakening of pain through memory is one of the objects among the motives of these disturbances. In general, one may distinguish two principal cases of name forgetting: when the name itself touches something unpleasant, or when it is brought into connection with other associations which are influenced by such effects, so that names can be disturbed on their own account, or on account of their nearer or more remote associative relations in the reproduction. A review of these general principles readily convinces us that the temporary forgetting of a name is observed as the most frequent faulty action of our mental functions. However, we are far from having described all the peculiarities of this phenomenon. I also wish to call attention to the fact that name forgetting is extremely contagious. In a conversation between two persons, the mere mention of having forgotten this or that name by one often suffices to induce the same memory slip in the other. But whenever the forgetting is induced, the sought-for name easily comes to the surface. There is also a continuous forgetting of names, in which whole chains of names are withdrawn from memory. If in the case of endeavoring to discover an escaped name one finds others, with which the latter is intimately connected, it often happens that these new names also escape. The forgetting thus jumps from one name to another, as if to demonstrate the existence of a hindrance not to be easily removed. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Childhood and Concealing Memories. In a second essay, I was able to demonstrate the purposive nature of our memories in an unexpected field. I started with the remarkable fact that the earliest recollections of a person often seem to preserve the unimportant and accidental, whereas, frequently, though not universally, not a trace is found in the adult memory of the weighty and effective impressions of this period. As it is known that the memory exercises a certain selection among the impressions at its disposal, it would seem logical to suppose that this selection follows entirely different principles in childhood than at the time of intellectual maturity. However, close investigation points to the fact that such an assumption is superfluous. The indifferent childhood memories owe existence to a process of displacement. It can be shown by psychoanalysis that in the reproduction they represent the substitute for other really significant impressions, whose reproduction is hindered by some resistance. As they do not owe their existence to their contents, but to an associative relation of their contents to another repressed thought, they deserve the title of concealing memories, by which I have designated them. In the aforementioned essay, I only touched upon, but in no way exhausted, the varieties in the relations and meanings of concealed memories. In the given example, fully analyzed, I particularly emphasized a peculiarity in temporal relation between the concealing memory and the contents of the memory concealed by it. The content of the concealing memory in that example belonged to one of the first years of childhood, while the thoughts represented by it, which remained practically unconscious, belonged to a later period of the individual in question. I called this form of displacement a retroactive or regressive one. Perhaps more often one finds the reversed relation, that is, an indifferent impression of the most remote period becomes a concealing memory in consciousness, which simply owes its existence to an association with an earlier experience, against whose direct reproduction there are resistances. We would call these encroaching or interposing concealing memories. What most concerns the memory lies here chronologically beyond the concealing memory. Finally, there may be a third possible case, namely, the concealing memory may be connected with the impression it conceals, not only through its content, but also through contiguity in time. This is the contemporaneous or contiguous concealing memory. How large a portion of the sum total of our memory belongs to the category of concealing memories, and what part it plays in various neurotic hidden processes, these are problems into the value of which I have neither inquired nor shall I enter here. I am concerned only with emphasizing the sameness between the forgetting of proper names with faulty recollection and the formation of concealing memories. At first sight, it would seem that the diversities of both phenomena are far more striking than their exact analogies. There we deal with proper names, here with complete impressions experienced either in reality or in thought. There we deal with a manifest failure of the memory function, here with the memory act which appears strange to us. Again, there we are concerned with a momentary disturbance, for the name just forgotten could have been reproduced correctly 100 times before, and will be so again from tomorrow on. Here we deal with lasting possession without a failure, for the indifferent childhood memories seem to be able to accompany us through a great part of life. In both these cases, the riddle seems to be solved in an entirely different way. There it is the forgetting, while here it is the remembering, which excites our scientific curiosity. After deeper reflection, one realizes that though there is a diversity in the psychic material and in the duration of time of the two phenomena, yet these are by far outweighed by the conformities between the two. In both cases, we deal with the failure to remember what should be correctly reproduced by memory fails to appear, and instead something else comes as a substitute. In the case of forgetting a name, there is no lack of memory function in the form of name substitution. The formation of a concealing memory depends on the forgetting of other important impressions. In both cases, we are reminded by an intellectual feeling of the intervention of a disturbance, which in each case takes a different form. In the case of forgetting of names, we are aware that the substitutive names are incorrect. In concealing memories, we are surprised that we have them at all. Hence, if psychological analysis demonstrates that the substitutive formation in each case is brought about in the same manner, that is, through displacement along a superficial association, we are justified in saying that the diversities in material, in duration of time, and in the centering of both phenomena serve to enhance our expectation that we have discovered something that is important and of general value. This generality purports that the stopping and straying of the reproducing function indicates more often than we suppose that there is an intervention of a prejudicial factor, a tendency which favors one memory and at the same time works against another. The subject of childhood memories appears to me so important and interesting that I would like to devote to it a few additional remarks which go beyond the views expressed so far. How far back into childhood do our memories reach? I am familiar with some investigations on this question by V. and C. Henry and Potwin. They assert that such examinations show wide individual variations, inasmuch as some trace their first reminiscences to the 6th month of life, while others can recall nothing of their lives before the end of the 6th or even the 8th year. But what connection is there between these variations in the behavior of childhood reminiscences, and what significance may be ascribed to them? It seems that it is not enough to procure the material for this question by simple inquiry, but it must later be subjected to a study in which the person furnishing the information must participate. I believe we accept too indifferently the fact of infantile amnesia, that is, the failure of memory for the first years of our lives, and fail to find in it a strange riddle. We forget of what great intellectual accomplishments and of what complicated emotions a child of 4 years is capable. We really ought to wonder why the memory of later years has, as a rule, retained so little of these psychic processes, especially as we have every reason for assuming that these same forgotten childhood activities have not glided off without leaving a trace in the development of the person, but that they have left a definite influence for all future time. Yet, in spite of this unparalleled effectiveness, they were forgotten. This would suggest that there are particularly formed conditions of memory, in the sense of conscious reproduction, which have thus far eluded our knowledge. It is possible that the forgetting of childhood gives us the key to understanding of amnesias, which, according to our newer studies, lie at the basis of the formation of all neurotic symptoms. Of these retained childhood reminiscences, some appear to us readily comprehensible, while others seem strange or unintelligible. It is not difficult to correct certain errors in regard to both kinds. If the retained reminiscences of a person are subjected to an analytic test, it can be readily ascertained that a guarantee for their correctness does not exist. Some of the memory pictures are surely falsified and incomplete, or displaced in point of time and place. The assertions of persons examined that their first memories reach back perhaps to their 2nd year are evidently unreliable. Motives can soon be discovered which explain the disfigurement and the displacement of these experiences, but they also demonstrate that these memory lapses are not the result of a mere unreliable memory. Powerful forces from a later period have molded the memory capacity of our infantile experiences, and it is probably due to these same forces that the understanding of our childhood is generally so very strange to us. The recollection of adults, as is known, proceeds through different psychic material. Some recall by means of visual pictures. Their memories are of a visual character. Other individuals can scarcely reproduce in memory the most paltry sketch of an experience. We call such persons auditifs and moteurs, in contrast to the visuels, terms proposed by Charcot. These differences vanish in dreams. All our dreams are predominantly visual. But this development is also found in childhood memories. The latter are plastic and visual, even in those people whose later memory lacks the visual element. The visual memory, therefore, preserves the type of the infantile recollections. Only my earliest childhood memories are of visual character. They represent plastic depicted scenes, comparable only to stage settings. In these scenes of childhood, whether they prove true or false, one usually sees his childish person both in contour and dress. This circumstance must excite our wonder, for adults do not see their own persons in their recollections of later experience. It is, moreover, against our experiences to assume that the child's attention during his experiences is centered on himself rather than exclusively on outside impressions. Various sources force us to assume the so-called earliest childhood recollections are not true memory traces, but later elaborations of the same, elaborations which might have been subjected to the influence of many later psychic forces. Thus, the childhood reminiscences of individuals altogether advance to the significance of concealing memories, and thereby form a noteworthy analogy to the childhood reminiscences as laid down in the legends and myths of nations. Whoever has examined mentally a number of persons by the method of psychoanalysis must have gathered in this work numerous examples of concealing memories of every description. However, owing to the previously discussed nature of the relations of the childhood reminiscences to later life, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to report such examples. For in order to attach the value of the concealing memory to an infantile reminiscence, it would be often necessary to present the entire life history of the person concerned. Only seldom is it possible, as in the following good example, to take out from its context and report a single childhood memory. A 24-year-old man preserved the following picture from the 5th year of his life. In the garden of a summer house he sat on a stool next to his aunt, who was engaged in teaching him the alphabet. He found difficulty in distinguishing the letter M from N, and begged his aunt to tell him how to tell one from the other. His aunt called his attention to the fact that the letter M had one whole portion, a stroke, more than the letter N. There was no reason to dispute the reliability of the childhood recollection. Its meaning, however, was discovered only later, when it showed itself to be the symbolic representation of another boyish inquisitiveness. For just as he wanted to know the difference between M and N in that time, so he concerned himself later about the difference between boy and girl, and he would have been willing that just this aunt should be his teacher. He also discovered that the difference was a similar one, that the boy again had one portion more than the girl, and at the time of this recognition his memory awoke to the corresponding childish inquisitiveness. I would like to show by one more example the sense that may be gained by a childhood reminiscence through analytic work, although it may seem to contain no sense before. In my 43rd year, when I began to interest myself in what remained in my memory of my own childhood, a scene struck me which for a long time, as I afterwards believed, had repeatedly come to consciousness, and which, through reliable identification, could be traced to a period before the completion of my 3rd year. I saw myself in front of a chest, the door of which was held open by my half-brother, 20 years my senior. I stood there demanding something and screaming. My mother, pretty and slender, then suddenly entered the room, as if returning from the street. In these words I formulated this scene so vividly seen, which, however, furnished no other clue. Whether my brother wished to open or lock the chest, in the first explanation it was a cupboard, why I cried, and what bearing the arrival of my mother had, all these questions were dim to me. I was tempted to explain to myself that it dealt with the memory of a hoax by my older brother, which was interrupted by my mother. Such misunderstandings of childhood scenes retained in memory are not uncommon. We recall a situation, but it is not centralized. We do not know on which of the elements to place the psychic accent. Analytic effort led me to an entirely unexpected solution of the picture. I missed my mother, and began to suspect that she was locked in the cupboard or chest, and therefore demanded that my brother should unlock it. As he obliged me, and I became convinced that she was not in the chest, I began to cry. This is the moment firmly retained in the memory, which was directly followed by the appearance of my mother, who appeased my worry and anxiety. But how did the child get the idea of looking for the absent mother in the chest? Dreams which occurred at the same time pointed dimly to a nurse, concerning whom other reminiscences were retained, as, for example, that she conscientiously urged me to deliver to her the small coins which I received as gifts, a detail which in itself may lay claim to the value of a concealing memory for later things. I then concluded to facilitate for myself this time the task of interpretation, and asked my mother about that nurse. I found out all sorts of things, among others the fact that this shrewd but dishonest person had committed extensive robberies during the confinement of my mother, and that my half-brother was instrumental bringing her to justice. This information gave me the key to the memory from childhood, as through a sort of inspiration. The sudden disappearance of the nurse was not a matter of indifference to me. I had just asked this brother where she was, probably because I had noticed that he had played a part in her disappearance, and he, evasive and witty as he is to this day, answered that she was boxed in. I understood this answer in the childish way, but asked no more, as there was nothing else to be discovered. When my mother left shortly thereafter, I suspected that the naughty brother had treated her in the same way as he did the nurse, and therefore pressed him to open the chest. I also understand now why, in the translation of the visual childhood scene, my mother's slenderness was accentuated. She must have struck me as being newly restored. I am 2.5 years older than the sister born that time, and when I was 3 years of age I was separated from my half-brother. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Mistakes in Speech. Although the ordinary material of speech of our mother tongue seems to be guarded against forgetting, its application, however, more often succumbs to another disturbance which is familiar to us as slips of the tongue. What we observe in normal persons as slips of the tongue gives the same impression as the first step of the so-called paraphasias, which manifest themselves under pathological conditions. I am in the exceptional position of being about to refer to a previous work on the subject. In the year 1895, Meringer and C. Meyer published a study on mistakes in speech and reading, with whose viewpoints I do not agree. One of the authors, who is the spokesman in the text, is a philologist actuated by a linguistic interest to examine the rules governing those slips. He hoped to deduce from these rules the existence, quote, of a definite psychic mechanism, whereby the sounds of a word, of a sentence, and even the words themselves, would be associated and connected with one another in a quite peculiar manner. End quote. The authors grouped the examples of speech mistakes collected by them, first according to purely descriptive viewpoints, such as interchangings, for example, Milo of Venus instead of Venus of Milo; as anticipations, for example, the shoes made her sore, instead of the shoes made her feet sore; as echoes and postpositions; as contaminations, for example, I will soon him home, instead of I will soon go home and will see him; and substitutions, for example, he entrusted his money to a savings crank, instead of a savings bank. Besides these principal categories, there are some others of lesser importance, or of lesser significance for our purpose. In this grouping it makes no difference whether the transposition, disfigurement, fusion, etc., affects single sounds of the word or syllable, or whole words of the concerned sentence. To explain the various forms of mistakes in speech, Meringer assumes a varied psychic value of phonetics. As soon as the innervation affects the first syllable of a word, or the first word of a sentence, the stimulating process immediately strikes the succeeding sounds and the following words, and in so far as these innervations are synchronous, they may effect some changes in one another. The stimulus of the psychically more intensive sound rings before or continues echoing, and thus disturbs the less important process of innervation. It is necessary, therefore, to determine which are the most important sounds of a word. Meringer states, if one wishes to know which sound of a word possesses the greatest intensity, he should examine himself while searching for a forgotten word, for example, a name. That which first returns to consciousness invariably has the greatest intensity prior to the forgetting. Thus, the most important sounds are the initial sound of the root syllable and the initial sound of the word itself, as well as one or another of the accentuated vowels." End quote. Here I cannot help voicing contradiction. Whether or not the initial sound of the name belongs to the most important elements of the word, it is surely not true that in the case of the forgetting of the word it first returns to consciousness. The above rule is therefore of no use. When we observe ourselves during the search for a forgotten name, we are comparatively often forced to express the opinion that it begins with a certain letter. This conviction proves to be as often unfounded as founded. Indeed, I would even go so far as to assert that in the majority of cases one reproduces a false initial sound. Also, in our example Signorelli, the substitutive name lacked the initial sound, and the principal syllables were lost. On the other hand, the less important pair of syllables, Elli, returned to consciousness in the substitutive name Botticelli. How little substitutive names respect the initial sound of the lost names may be learned from the following case. One day I found it impossible to recall the name of the small country whose capital is Monte Carlo. The substitutive names were as follows: Piedmont, Albania, Montevideo, Calico. In place of Albania, Montenegro soon appeared, and then it struck me that the syllable Mont occurred in all but the last of the substitutive names. It thus became easy for me to find from the name of Prince Albert the forgotten name Monaco. Calico practically imitates the syllabic sequence and rhythm of the forgotten word. If we admit the conjecture that a mechanism similar to that pointed out in the forgetting of names may also play a part in the phenomena of speech blunders, we are then led to a better founded judgment of cases of speech blunders. The speech disturbance, which manifests itself as a speech blunder, may in the first place be caused by the influence of another component of the same speech, that is, through a foresound or an echo, or through another meaning within the sentence or context, which differs from that which the speaker wishes to utter. In the second place, however, the disturbance could be brought about, analogously to the process in the case of Signorelli, through influences outside the word, sentence, or context, from elements which we did not intend to express, and of whose incitement we became conscious only through the disturbance. In both modes of origin of the mistaken speech, the common element lies in the simultaneity of the stimulus, while the differentiating elements lie in the arrangement within or without the same sentence or context. The difference does not at first appear as wide as when it is taken into consideration in certain conclusions drawn from the symptomatology of speech mistakes. It is clear, however, that only in the first case is there a prospect of drawing conclusions from the manifestations of speech blunders concerning a mechanism which connects together sounds and words for the reciprocal influence of their articulation, that is, conclusions such as the philologist hopes to gain from the study of speech blunders. In the case of disturbance through influence outside of the same sentence or context, it would before all be a question of becoming acquainted with the disturbing elements, and then the question would arise whether the mechanism of this disturbance cannot also suggest the probable laws of the formation of speech. We cannot maintain that Meringer and Meyer have overlooked the possibility of speech disturbance through complicated psychic influences, that is, through elements outside the same word or sentence or the same sequence of words. Indeed, they must have observed that the theory of the psychic variation of sounds applies, strictly speaking, only to the explanation of sound disturbance, as well as to foresounds and aftersounds. When the word disturbances cannot be reduced to sound disturbances, as, for example, in the substitutions and contaminations of words, they too have without hesitation sought the cause of the mistake in speech outside of the intended context, and proved this state of affairs by means of fitting examples. According to the author's own understanding, it is some similarity between a certain word in the intended sentence and some other not intended, which allows the latter to assert itself in consciousness by causing a disfigurement, or a compromise formation, contamination. Now, in my work on the interpretation of dreams, I have shown the part played by the process of condensation in the origin of the so-called manifest contents of the dream from the latent thoughts of the dream. Any similarity of objects or of word presentations between two elements of the unconscious material is taken as a cause for the formation of a third, which is a composite or compromise formation. This element represents both components in the dream content, and in view of this origin it is frequently endowed with numerous contradictory individual determinants. The formation of substitutions and contaminations in speech mistakes is therefore the beginning of that work of condensation which we find taking a most active part in the construction of the dream. In a small essay destined for the general reader, Mehringer advanced a theory of very practical significance for certain cases of interchanging of words, especially for such cases where one word is substituted by another of opposite meaning. He says, "We may still recall the manner in which the President of the Austrian House of Deputies opened the session some time ago. 'Honored sirs, I announce the presence of so and so many gentlemen, and therefore declare the session is closed.' The general merriment first attracted his attention, and he corrected his mistake. In the present case, the probable explanation is that the President wished himself in a position to close this session, from which he had little good to expect, and the thought broke through, at least partially, a frequent manifestation, resulting in his use of closed in place of opened, that is, the opposite of the statement intended. Numerous observations have taught me, however, that we frequently interchange contrasting words. They are always associated in our speech consciousness. They lie very close together, and are easily incorrectly evoked. Still, not in all cases of contrast substitution is it so simple as in the example of the President as to appear plausible that the speech mistake occurs merely as a contradiction which arises in the inner thought of the speaker opposing the sentence uttered. We have found the analogous mechanism in the analysis of the example aliquis. There the inner contradiction asserts itself in the form of forgetting a word instead of a substitution through its opposite. But in order to adjust the difference, we may remark that the little word aliquis is incapable of a contrast similar to closing and opening, and that the word opening cannot be subject to forgetting on account of its being a common component of speech. Having been shown by the last examples of Mehringer and Meyer that speech disturbance may be caused through the influence of fore sounds, after sounds, words from the same sentence that were intended for expression, as well as through the effect of words outside the sentence intended, the stimulus of which would otherwise not have been suspected, we shall next wish to discover whether we can definitely separate the two classes of mistakes in speech, and how we can distinguish the example of the one from a case of the other class. But at this stage of the discussion we must also think of the assertions of Wundt, who deals with the manifestations of speech mistakes in his recent work on the development of language. Psychic influences, according to Wundt, never lack in these as well as in other phenomena related to them. Quote, "The uninhibited stream of sound and word associations stimulated by spoken sounds belongs here in the first place as a positive determinant. This is supported as a negative factor by the relaxation or suppression of the influences of the will which inhibit this stream, and by the active attention which is here a function of volition. Whether that play of association manifests itself in the fact that a coming sound is anticipated or a preceding sound reproduced, or whether a familiar practiced sound becomes intercalated between others, or finally whether it manifests itself in the fact that altogether different sounds associatively related to the spoken sounds act upon these, all these questions designate only differences in the direction, and at most in the play of the occurring associations, but not in the general nature of the same. In some cases it may be also doubtful to which form a certain disturbance may be attributed, or whether it would not be more correct to refer such disturbance to a concurrence of many motives, following the principle of the complication of causes." End quote. I consider these observations of Wundt as absolutely justified and very instructive. Perhaps we could emphasize with even greater firmness than Wundt that the positive factor favoring mistakes in speech, the uninhibited stream of associations, and its negative, the relaxation of the inhibiting attention, regularly attain synchronous action, so that both factors become only different determinants of the same process. With the relaxation, or more unequivocally expressed through this relaxation, of the inhibiting attention, the uninhibited stream of associations becomes active. Among the examples of the mistakes in speech collected by me, I can scarcely find one in which I would be obliged to attribute the speech disturbance simply and solely to what Wundt calls contact effect of sound. Almost invariably I discover besides this a disturbing influence of something outside the intended speech. The disturbing element is either a single unconscious thought, which comes to light through the speech blunder, and can only be brought to consciousness through a searching analysis, or it is a more general psychic motive, which directs itself against the entire speech. Example A. Seeing my daughter make an unpleasant face while biting into an apple, I wish to quote the following couplet: "The ape he is a funny sight, when in the apple he does bite." But I began with the apple, which seems to be a contamination of ape and apple, compromise formation, or it may be also conceived as an anticipation of the prepared apple. The true state of affairs, however, was this: I began the quotation once before, and made no mistake the first time. I made the mistake only during the repetition, which was necessary because my daughter, having been distracted from another side, did not listen to me. This repetition, with the added impatience to disburden myself of the sentence, I must include in the motivation of the speech blunder, which represented itself as a function of condensation. B. My daughter said I wrote to Mrs. Schlesinger. The woman's name was Schlesinger. This speech blunder may depend on the tendency to facilitate articulation. I must state, however, that this mistake was made by my daughter a few moments after I had said apple instead of ape. Mistakes in speech are in a great measure contagious. A similar peculiarity was noticed by Meringer and Meyer in the forgetting of names. I know of no reason for this psychic contagiousness. C. I sat up like a pocket knife, said a patient in the beginning of treatment, instead of I shut up. This suggests a difficulty of articulation which may serve as an excuse for the interchanging of sounds. When her attention was called to the speech blunder, she promptly replied, "Yes, that happened because you said earnest instead of earnest." As a matter of fact, I received her with the remark, "Today we shall be in earnest," because it was the last hour before her discharge from treatment, and I jokingly changed the word into earnest. In the course of the hour she repeatedly made mistakes in speech, and I finally observed that it was not only because she imitated me, but because she had a special reason in her unconscious to linger at the word earnest, Ernst, as a name. D. A woman, speaking about a game invented by her children and called by them the man in the box, said the Manx in the box. I could readily understand her mistake. It was while analyzing her dream, in which her husband is depicted as very generous in money matters, just the reverse of reality, that she made this speech blunder. The day before she had asked for a new set of furs, which her husband denied her, claiming that he could not afford to spend so much money. She upbraided him for his stinginess, for putting away so much into the strong box, and mentioned a friend whose husband has not nearly his income, and yet he presented his wife with a mink coat for her birthday. The mistake is now comprehensible. The word Manx refers to the minx which she longs for, and the box refers to her husband's stinginess. E. A similar mechanism is shown in the mistake of another patient whose memory deserted her in the midst of a long-forgotten childish reminiscence. Her memory failed to inform her on what part of the body the prying and lustful hand of another had touched her. Soon thereafter she visited one of her friends with whom she discussed summer homes. Asked where her cottage in M was located, she answered, "Near the mountain loin," instead of the mountain lane. F. Another patient, whom I asked at the end of her visit how her uncle was, answered, "I don't know. I only see him now in flagranti." The following day she said, "I am really ashamed of myself for having given you yesterday such a stupid answer. Naturally you must have thought me a very uneducated person, who always mistakes the meaning of foreign words. I wished to say en passant." We did not know at the time where she got the incorrectly used foreign words, but during the same session she reproduced a reminiscence as a continuation of the theme from the previous day, in which being caught in flagranti played the principal part. The mistake of the previous day had therefore anticipated the recollection, which at that time had not yet become conscious. G. In discussing her summer plans, a patient said, "I shall remain most of the summer in Elberland." She noted her mistake, and asked me to analyze it. The associations to Elberland elicited: seashore on the Jersey coast, summer resort, vacation traveling. This recalled traveling in Europe with her cousin, a topic which we had discussed the day before during the analysis of a dream. The dream dealt with her dislike for this cousin, and she admitted that it was mainly due to the fact that the latter was the favorite of the man whom they met together while traveling abroad. During the dream analysis she could not recall the name of the city in which they met this man, and I did not make any effort at the time to bring it to her consciousness, as we were engrossed in a totally different problem. When asked to focus her attention again on Elberland and reproduce her associations, she said, "It brings to mind Elbe, lawn, field, and Elberfeld." Elberfeld was the lost name of the city in Germany. Here the mistake served to bring to consciousness, in a concealed manner, a memory which was connected with a painful feeling. H. A woman said to me, "If you wish to buy a carpet, go to Merchant's in Matthew Street." I repeated, "Then at Matthew's, I mean at Merchant's." It would seem that my repeating of one name in place of the other was simply the result of distraction. The woman's remark really did distract me, as she turned my attention to something else much more vital to me than carpet. In Matthew Street stands the house in which my wife lived as a bride. The entrance to the house was in another street, and now I noticed that I had forgotten its name and could only recall it through a roundabout method. The name Matthew, which kept my attention, is thus a substitutive name for the forgotten name of the street. It is more suitable than the name Merchant, for Matthew is exclusively the name of a person, while Merchant is not. The forgotten street, too, bears the name of a person. I. A patient consulted me for the first time, and from her history it became apparent that the cause of her nervousness was largely an unhappy married life. Without any encouragement, she went into details about her marital troubles. She had not lived with her husband for about 6 months, and she saw him last at the theater, when she saw the play Officer 606. I called her attention to the mistake, and she immediately corrected herself, saying that she meant to say Officer 666, the name of a recent popular play. I decided to find out the reason for the mistake, and as the patient came to me for analytic treatment, I discovered that the immediate cause of the rupture between herself and her husband was the disease which is treated by 606. K. Before calling on me, a patient telephoned for an appointment, and also wished to be informed about my consultation fee. He was told that the first consultation was $10. After the examination was over, he again asked what he was to pay, and added, "I don't like to owe money to anyone, especially to doctors. I prefer to pay right away." Instead of pay, he said play. His last voluntary remarks and his mistake put me on guard. But after a few more uncalled for remarks, he set me at ease by taking money from his pocket. He counted 4 paper dollars, and was very chagrined and surprised because he had no more money with him, and promised to send me a check for the balance. I was sure that his mistake betrayed him, that he was only playing with me, but there was nothing to be done. At the end of a few weeks I sent him a bill for the balance, and the letter was returned to me by the post office authorities marked "Not Found." L. Miss X spoke very warmly of Mr. Y, which was rather strange, as before this she had always expressed her indifference, not to say her contempt, for him. On being asked about this sudden change of heart, she said I really never had anything against him. He was always nice to me, but I never gave him the chance to cultivate my acquaintance. She said "cuptivate." This neologism was a contamination of cultivate and captivate, and foretold the coming betrothal. M. An illustration of the mechanisms of contamination and condensation will be found in the following lapsus linguae. Speaking of Miss Z, Miss W depicted her as a very straight-laced person, who was not given to levities, etc. Miss X thereupon remarked, "Yes, that is a very characteristic description. She always appealed to me as very straight-braced." Here the mistake resolved itself into straight-laced and brazen-faced, which correspond to Miss W.'s opinion of Miss Z. N. I shall quote a number of examples from a paper by my colleague Dr. Steckel, which appeared in the Berlin Tageblatt in January 1904, entitled Unconscious Confessions. An unpleasant trick of my unpleasant thoughts was revealed by the following example. To begin with, I may state that in my capacity as a physician I never consider my remuneration, but always keep in view the patient's interest only. This goes without saying. I was visiting a patient who was convalescing from a serious illness. We had passed through hard days and nights. I was happy to find her improved, and I portrayed to her the pleasures of a sojourn to Abbasia, concluding with, "If, as I hope, you will not soon leave your bed." This obviously came from an unconscious selfish motive, to be able to continue treating this wealthy patient, a wish which is entirely foreign to my waking consciousness, and which I would reject with indignation. O. Another example from Dr. Steckel. My wife engaged a French governess for the afternoons, and later, coming to a satisfactory agreement, wished to retain her testimonials. The governess begged to be allowed to keep them, saying, "Je cherche encore pour les après-midi, pardon pour les avant-midi." She apparently intended to seek another place which would perhaps offer more profitable arrangements, an intention which she carried out. P. I was to give a lecture to a woman. Her husband, upon whose request this was done, stood behind the door listening. At the end of my sermonizing, which had made a visible impression, I said, "Good-bye, sir." To the experienced person I thus betrayed the fact that the words were directed toward the husband, that I had spoken to oblige him. Q. Dr. Steckel reports about himself that he had under treatment at the same time two patients from Trieste, each of whom he always addressed incorrectly. "Good morning, Mr. Poloni," he would say to Ascoli, and to Poloni, "Good morning, Mr. Ascoli." He was at first inclined to attribute no deeper motive to this mistake, but to explain it through a number of similarities in both persons. However, he easily convinced himself that there the interchange of names bespoke a sort of boast. That is, he was acquainting each of his Italian patients with the fact that neither was the only resident of Trieste who came to Vienna in search of his medical advice. R. Two women stopped in front of a drugstore, and one said to her companion, "If you will wait a few moments, I'll soon be back." But she said movements instead. She was on her way to buy some castoria for her child. S. Mr. L., who was fonder of being called on than of calling, spoke to me through the telephone from a nearby summer resort. He wanted to know when I could pay him a visit. I reminded him that it was his turn to visit me, and called his attention to the fact that as he was the happy possessor of an automobile, it would be easier for him to call on me. We were at different summer resorts, separated by almost 1/2 hour's railway trip. He gladly promised to call, and asked, "How about Labor Day, September 1st? Will it be convenient for you?" When I answered affirmatively, he said, "Very well, then, put me down for Election Day, November." His mistake was quite plain. He likes to visit me, but it was inconvenient to travel so far. In November we would both be in the city. My analysis proved correct. T. A friend described to me a nervous patient, and wished to know whether I could benefit him. I remarked, I believe that in time I can remove all his symptoms by psychoanalysis, because it is a durable case, wishing to say curable. U. I repeatedly addressed my patient as Mrs. Smith, her married daughter's name, when her real name is Mrs. James. My attention having been called to it, I soon discovered that I had another patient of the same name who refused to pay for the treatment. Mrs. Smith was also my patient, and paid her bills promptly. V. A lapsus linguae sometimes stands for a particular characteristic. A young woman who is the domineering spirit in her home said of her ailing husband that he had consulted the doctor about a wholesome diet for himself, and then added, "The doctor said that diet has nothing to do with his ailments, and that he can eat and drink what I want." W. I cannot omit this excellent and instructive example, although according to my authority it is about 20 years old. A lady once expressed herself in society. The very words show that they were uttered with fervour, and under the pressure of a great many secret emotions. "Yes, a woman must be pretty if she is to please the men. A man is much better off. As long as he has 5 straight limbs he needs no more." This example affords us a good insight into the intimate mechanisms of a mistake in speech by means of condensation and contamination. It is quite obvious that we have here a fusion of 2 similar modes of expression. As long as he has 4 straight limbs, or as long as he has 5 senses, or the term straight may be the common element of the 2 intended expressions. As long as he has straight limbs, all 5 should be straight. It may also be assumed that both modes of expression, those of the 5 senses and those of the straight 5, have cooperated to introduce into the sentence about the straight limbs first a number and then the mysterious 5 instead of the simple 4. But this fusion surely would not have succeeded if it had not expressed good sense in the form resulting from the mistake, if it had not expressed a cynical truth which naturally could not be uttered unconcealed, coming as it did from a woman. Finally, we shall not hesitate to call attention to the fact that the woman's saying, following its wording, could just as well be an excellent witticism as a jocose speech blunder. It is simply a question whether she uttered these words with conscious or unconscious intention. The behavior of the speaker in the case certainly speaks against the conscious intention, and thus excludes wit. X. Owing to similarity of material, I add here another case of speech blunder, the interpretation of which requires less skill. A professor of anatomy strove to explain the nostril, which, as is known, is a very difficult anatomical structure. To his question whether his audience grasped his ideas, he received an affirmative reply. The professor, known for his self-esteem, thereupon remarked, "I can hardly believe this, for the number of people who understand the nostril, even in a city of millions like Vienna, can be counted on a finger. Pardon me, I meant to say the fingers of a hand." Why? I am indebted to Dr. Alf Robertsek of Vienna for calling my attention to 2 speech blunders from an old French author, which I shall reproduce in the original. There follows a rather lengthy story in French. In the psychotherapeutic procedure which I employ in the solution and removal of neurotic symptoms, I am often confronted with the task of discovering from the accidental utterances and fancies of the patient the thought contents, which, though striving for concealment, nevertheless unintentionally betray themselves. In doing this, the mistakes often perform the most valuable service, as I can show through most convincing and still most singular examples. For example, patients speak of an aunt, and later, without noting the mistake, call her my mother, or designate a husband as a brother. In this way they attract my attention to the fact that they have identified these persons with each other, that they have placed them in the same category, which for their emotional life signifies the recurrence of the same type. Or a young man of 20 years presents himself during my office hours with these words, "I am the father of N.N. whom you have treated. Pardon me, I mean the brother. Why, he is 4 years older than I." I understand through this mistake that he wishes to express that, like the brother, he too is ill through the fault of the father. Like his brother, he wishes to be cured, but that the father is the one most in need of treatment. At other times an unusual arrangement of words, or a forced expression, is sufficient to disclose in the speech of the patient the participation of a repressed thought having a different motive. Hence, in coarse as well as in finer speech disturbances, which may nevertheless be subsumed as speech blunders, I find that it is not the contact effects of the sound, but the thoughts outside the intended speech, which determine the origin of the speech blunder, and also suffice to explain the newly formed mistakes in speech. I do not doubt the laws whereby the sounds produce changes upon one another, but they alone do not appear to me sufficiently forcible to mar the correct execution of speech. In those cases which I have studied and investigated more closely, they merely represent the performed mechanism, which is conveniently utilized by a more remote psychic motive. The latter does not, however, form a part of the sphere of influence of these sound relations. In a large number of substitutions caused by mistakes in talking, there is an entire absence of such phonetic laws. In this respect I am in full accord with Wundt, who likewise assumes that the conditions underlying speech blunders are complex, and go far beyond the contact effects of the sounds. If I accept as certain these more remote psychic influences, following Wundt's expression, there is still nothing to detain me from conceding also that in accelerated speech, with a certain amount of diverted attention, the causes of speech blunder may be easily limited to the definite law of Mehringer and Meyer. However, in a number of examples gathered by these authors, a more complicated solution is quite apparent. In some forms of speech blunders we may assume that the disturbing factor is the result of striking against obscene words and meanings. The purposive disfigurement and distortion of words and phrases, which is so popular with vulgar persons, aims at nothing else but the employing of a harmless motive as a reminder of the obscene, and this sport is so frequent that it would not be at all remarkable if it appeared unintentionally and contrary to the will. I trust that the readers will not depreciate the value of these interpretations, for which there is no proof, and of these examples, which I have myself collected and explained by means of analysis. But if secretly I still cherish the expectation that even the apparent simple cases of speech blunder will be traced to a disturbance caused by a half-repressed idea outside of the intended context, I am tempted to it by a noteworthy observation of Mehringer. This author asserts that it is remarkable that nobody wishes to admit having made a mistake in speaking. There are many intelligent and honest people who are offended if we tell them that they made a mistake in speaking. I would not risk making this assertion as general as does Mehringer, using the term nobody, but the emotional trace which clings to the demonstration of the mistake, which manifestly belongs to the nature of shame, has its significance. It may be classed with the anger displayed at the inability to recall a forgotten name, and with the surprise at the tenaciousness of an apparently indifferent memory, and it invariably points to the participation of a motive in the formation of the disturbance. The distorting of names amounts to an insult when done intentionally, and could have the same significance in a whole series of cases where it appears as unintentional speech blunders. The person who, according to Meyer's report, once said Freuder instead of Freud, because shortly before he pronounced the name Breuer, and who at another time spoke of Freuer-Breudian method, was certainly not particularly enthusiastic over this method. Later, under the mistakes in writing, I shall report a case of name disfigurement, which certainly admits of no other explanation. As a disturbing element in these cases, there is an intermingling of a criticism which must be omitted, because at the time being it does not correspond to the intention of the speaker. Or it may be just the reverse. The substituted name or the adoption of the strange name signifies an appreciation of the same. The identification which is brought about by the mistake is equivalent to recognition, which for the moment must remain in the background. An experience of this kind from the school days is related by Dr. Ferenczi. While in my first year at college, I was obliged to recite a poem before the whole class. It was the first experience of the kind in my life, but I was well prepared. As soon as I began my recitation, I was dismayed at being disturbed by an outburst of laughter. The professor later explained to me this strange reception. I started by giving the title, "From the Distance," which was correct, but instead of giving the name of the real author, I mentioned my own. The name of the poet is Alexander Petofi. The identity of the first name with my own favored the interchange of names, but the real reason was surely the fact that I identified myself at that time with the celebrated poet hero. Even consciously I entertained for him a love and respect which verged on adoration, the whole ambition complex hides itself under this faulty action. A similar identification was reported to me concerning a young physician who timidly and reverently introduced himself to the celebrated Virchow with the following words: "I am Dr. Virchow." The surprised professor turned to him and asked, "Is your name also Virchow?" I do not know how the ambitious young man justified his speech blunder, whether he thought of the charming excuse that he imagined himself so insignificant next to the big man that his own name slipped from him, or whether he had the courage to admit that he hoped that he too would some day be as great as the man Virchow, and that the professor should therefore not treat him in too disparaging a manner. One or both of these thoughts may have put the young man in an embarrassing position during the introduction. Owing to very personal motives, I must leave it undecided whether a similar interpretation may also apply in the case to be cited. At the International Congress in Amsterdam in 1907, my theories of hysteria were the subject of a lively discussion. One of my most violent opponents, in his diatribe against me, repeatedly made mistakes in speech in such a manner that he put himself in my place and spoke in my name. He said, for example, "Brewer and I, as is well known, have demonstrated," etc., etc., when he wished to say Brewer and Freud. The name of this opponent does not show the slightest sound similarity to my own. From this example, as well as from other cases of interchanging names in speech blunders, we are reminded of the fact that the speech blunder can fully forego the facility afforded to it through similar sounds, and can achieve its purpose if only supported in content by concealed relations. In other and more significant cases it is a self-criticism, an internal contradiction against one's own utterance, which causes the speech blunder, and even forces a contrasting substitution for the one intended. We then observe with surprise how the wording of an assertion removes the purpose of the same, and how the error in speech lays bare the inner dishonesty. Here the lapsus linguae becomes a mimicking form of expression, often, indeed, for the expression of what one does not wish to say. It is thus a means of self-betrayal. Brill relates, "I had recently been consulted by a woman who showed many paranoid trends, and as she had no relatives who could cooperate with me, I urged her to enter a state hospital as a voluntary patient. She was quite willing to do so, but on the following day she told me that her friends, with whom she leased an apartment, objected to her going to a hospital, as it would interfere with their plans," and so on. I lost patience, and said, "There is no use listening to your friends who know nothing about your mental condition. You are quite incompetent to take care of your own affairs." I meant to say competent. Here the lapsus linguae expressed my true opinion. Favored by chance, the speech material often gives origin to examples of speech blunders, which serve to bring about an overwhelming revelation of a full comic effect, as shown by the following examples reported by Brill. A wealthy but not very generous host invited his friends for an evening dance. Everything went well until about 11:30 p.m., when there was an intermission, presumably for supper. To the great disappointment of most of the guests, there was no supper. Instead, they were regaled with thin sandwiches and lemonade. As it was close to election day, the conversation centered on the different candidates, and as the discussion grew warmer, one of the guests, an ardent admirer of the Progressive Party candidate, remarked to the host, "You may say what you please about Teddy, but there is one thing that can always be relied upon. He always gives you a square meal," wishing to say square deal. The assembled guests burst into a roar of laughter, to the great embarrassment of the speaker and the host, who fully understood each other. While writing a prescription for a woman who was especially weighed down by the financial burden of the treatment, I was interested to hear her say suddenly, "Please do not give me big bills, because I cannot swallow them." Of course, she meant to say pills. The following example illustrates a rather serious case of self-betrayal through a mistake in talking. Some accessory details justify full reproduction, as first printed by Dr. A. Brill. While walking one night with Dr. Frink, we accidentally met a colleague, Dr. P., whom I had not seen for years, and of whose private life I knew nothing. We were naturally very pleased to meet again, and on my invitation he accompanied us to a cafe, where we spent about 2 hours in pleasant conversation. To my question as to whether he was married, he gave a negative answer, and added, "Why should a man like me marry?" On leaving the cafe, he suddenly turned to me and said, "I should like to know what you would do in a case like this. I know a nurse who was named as co-respondent in a divorce case. The wife sued the husband for divorce and named her as co-respondent, and he got the divorce." I interrupted him, saying, "You mean she got the divorce?" He immediately corrected himself, saying, "Yes, she got the divorce," and continued to tell how the excitement of the trial had affected this nurse to such an extent that she became nervous and took to drink. He wanted me to advise him how to treat her. As soon as I had corrected his mistake, I asked him to explain it, but as is usually the case, he was surprised at my question. He wanted to know whether a person had no right to make mistakes in talking. I explained to him that there is a reason for every mistake, and that if he had not told me that he was unmarried, I would say that he was the hero of the divorce case in question, and that the mistake showed that he wished he had obtained the divorce instead of his wife, so as not to be obliged to pay alimony and to be permitted to marry again in New York State. He stoutly denied my interpretation, but his emotional agitation, followed by loud laughter, only strengthened my suspicions. To my appeal that he should tell the truth for science sake, he said, "Unless you wish me to lie, you must believe that I was never married, and hence your psychoanalytic interpretation is all wrong." He, however, added that it was dangerous to be with a person who paid attention to such little things. Then he suddenly remembered that he had another appointment, and left us. Both Dr. Frink and I were convinced that the interpretation of his lapsus linguae was correct, and I decided to corroborate or disprove it by further investigation. The next day I found a neighbor, an old friend of Dr. P., who confirmed my interpretation in every particular. The divorce was granted to Dr. P.'s wife a few weeks before, and a nurse was named as co-respondent. A few weeks later I met Dr. P., and he told me that he was thoroughly convinced of the Freudian mechanisms. The self-betrayal is just as plain in the following case, reported by Otto Rank. A father who was devoid of all patriotic feeling and desirous of educating his children to be just as free from this superfluous sentiment, reproached his sons for participating in a patriotic demonstration, and rejected their reference to a similar behavior of their uncle with these words, "You are not obliged to imitate him. Why, he is an idiot." The astonished features of the children at their father's unusual tone aroused him to the fact that he had made a mistake, and he remarked apologetically, "Of course I wish to say patriot." When such a speech blunder occurs in a serious squabble, and reverses the intended meaning of one of the disputants, it at once puts him at a disadvantage with his adversary, a disadvantage which the latter seldom fails to utilize. This clearly shows that although people are unwilling to accept the theory of my conception, and are not inclined to forego the convenience that is connected with the tolerance of a faulty action, they nevertheless interpret speech blunders and other faulty acts in a manner similar to the one presented in this book. The merriment and derision which are sure to be evoked at the decisive moment through such linguistic mistakes speak conclusively against the generally accepted convention that such a speech blunder is a lapsus linguae and psychologically of no importance. It was no less a man than the German Chancellor who endeavored to save the situation through such a protest when the wording of his defense of his Emperor, November 1907, turned into the opposite through speech blunder. Concerning the present, a new epoch of Emperor Wilhelm II, I can only repeat what I said a year ago, that it would be unfair and unjust to speak of a coterie of responsible advisers around our emperor. Loud calls irresponsible. To speak of irresponsible advisers. Pardon the lapsus linguae. A nice example of speech blunder, which aims not so much at the betrayal of the speaker as at the enlightenment of the listener outside the scene, is found in Wallenstein. Piccolomini, Act 1, Scene 5, and shows us that the poet who here uses this means is well versed in the mechanism and intent of speech blunders. In the preceding scene, Max Piccolomini was passionately in favor of the ducal party, and was enthusiastic about the blessings of the peace which became known to him in the course of a journey while accompanying Wallenstein's daughter to the encampment. He leaves his father and the court ambassador, Questenberg, in great consternation. The scene proceeds as follows. Questenberg. Woe unto us! Are matters thus? Friend, should we allow him to go there with the false opinion, and not recall him at once in order to open his eyes instantly? Octavio, rousing himself from profound meditation. He has already opened mine, and I see more than pleases me. Questenberg. What is it, friend? Octavio. A curse on that journey. Questenberg. Why? What is it? Octavio. Come, I must immediately follow the unlucky trail, must see with my own eyes. Come. Wishes to lead him away. Questenberg. What is the matter? Where? Octavio, urging. To her. Questenberg. To... Octavio corrects himself. To the Duke. Let us go. The slight speech blunder, to her, in place of to him, is meant to betray to us the fact that the father has seen through his son's motive for espousing the other cause, while the courtier complains that he speaks to him altogether in riddles. Another example wherein a poet makes use of a speech blunder was discovered by Otto Rank in Shakespeare. I quote Rank's report from Zentroblatt für Psychoanalysis 1:3. A poetic speech blunder, very delicately motivated and technically remarkably utilized, which, like the one pointed out by Freud in Wallenstein, not only shows that poets know the mechanism and sense of this error, but also presupposes an understanding of it on the part of the hearer, can be found in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, Act 3, Scene 2. By the will of her fathers, Portia was bound to select a husband through a lottery. She escaped all her distasteful suitors by lucky chance. When she finally found in Bassanio the suitor after her own heart, she had cause to fear lest he, too, should draw the unlucky lottery. In the scene she would like to tell him that even if he chose the wrong casket, he might nevertheless be sure of love, but she is hampered by her vow. In this mental conflict, the poet uses these words in her mouth, which were directed to the welcome suitor. There is something tells me, but it is not love. I would not lose you, and you know yourself, hate counsels not in such a quality. But lest you should not understand me well, and yet a maiden hath no tongue but thought, I would detain you here some month or two, before you venture for me. I could teach you how to choose right, but then I am forsworn. So will I never be. So may you miss me. But if you do, you'll make me wish a sin, that I had been forsworn. Beshrew your eyes, they have overlooked me and divided me. One half of me is yours, the other half yours. Mine own, I would say, but if mine, then yours, and so all yours. Just the very thing which she would like to hint to him gently, because really she would keep it from him, namely, that even before the choice she is wholly his, that she loves him, the poet, with admirable psychologic sensitiveness, allows to come to the surface in the speech blunder. It is through this artifice that he manages to allay the intolerable uncertainty of the lover, as well as the like tension of the hearer concerning the outcome of the choice. The interest merited by the confirmation of our conception of speech blunders through the great poets justifies the citation of a third example which was reported by Dr. E. Jones. Our great novelist, George Meredith, in his masterpiece, The Egoist, shows an even finer understanding of the mechanism. The plot of the novel is shortly as follows. Sir Willoughby Patterne, an aristocrat greatly admired by his circle, becomes engaged to Miss Constantia Durham. She discovers in him an intense egoism, which he skilfully conceals from the world, and to escape the marriage she elopes with the Captain Oxford. Some years later, Patterne becomes engaged to a Miss Clara Middleton, and most of the book is taken up with a detailed description of the conflict that arises in her mind on also discovering his egotism. External circumstances and her conception of honor hold her to her pledge, while he becomes more and more distasteful in her eyes. She partly confided in her cousin and secretary, Vernon Whitford, the man whom she ultimately marries, but from a mixture of motives he stands aloof. In the soliloquy, Clara speaks as follows: "If some noble gentleman could see me as I am, and not disdain to aid me. Oh, to be caught out of this prison of thorns and brambles! I cannot tear my own way out. I am a coward. A beckoning of a finger would change me, I believe. I could fly bleeding and through hootings to a comrade. Constantia met a soldier. Perhaps she prayed, and her prayer was answered. She did ill, but oh, how I love her for it. His name was Harry Oxford. She did not waver. She cut the links. She signed herself over. Oh, brave girl, what do you think of me? But I have no Harry Whitford. I am alone." The sudden consciousness that she had put another name for Oxford struck her a buffet, drowning her in crimson. The fact that both men's names end in Ford evidently renders the confounding of them more easy, and would by many be regarded as an adequate cause for this, but the real underlying motive for it is plainly indicated by the author. In another passage the same lapsus occurs, and is followed by a hesitation and change of subject that one is familiar with in psychoanalysis when a half-conscious complex is touched. Sir Willoughby patronizingly says to Whitford, "False alarm! The resolution to do anything unaccustomed is quite beyond poor old Vernon." Clara replies, "But if Mr. Whitford, your swans coming sailing up the lake, how beautiful they are when they are indignant." I was going to ask you, surely men witnessing a marked admiration for someone else will naturally be discouraged. Sir Willoughby stiffened with sudden enlightenment. In still another passage, Clara, by another lapsus, betrays her secret wish that she was on a more intimate footing with Vernon Whitford. Speaking to a boy friend, she says, "Tell Mr. Vernon, tell Mr. Whitford." The conception of speech blunders, here defended, can be readily verified in the smallest details. I have been able to demonstrate repeatedly that the most insignificant and most natural cases of speech blunders have their good sense, and admit of the same interpretation as the most striking examples. A patient who, contrary to my wishes, but with firm personal motives, decided upon a short trip to Budapest, justified herself by saying that she was going for only 3 days, but she blundered, said only 3 weeks. She betrayed her secret feeling that to spite me she preferred spending 3 weeks to 3 days in that society which I considered unfit for her. One evening, wishing to excuse myself for not having called for my wife at the theatre, I said, "I was at the theatre at 10 minutes after 10. I was corrected. "You mean to say 10 o'clock." Naturally, I wanted to say before 10. After 10 would certainly be no excuse. I had been told that the theatre program read, "Finished before 10 o'clock." When we arrived at the theatre, I found the foyer dark and the theatre empty. Evidently the performance was over earlier, and my wife did not wait for me. When I looked at the clock, it still wanted 5 minutes to 10. I determined to make my case more favorable at home, and say that it was 10 minutes to 10. Unfortunately, the speech blunder spoiled the intent and laid bare my dishonesty, in which I acknowledged more than there really was to confess. This leads to those speech disturbances which can no longer be described as speech blunders, for they do not injure the individual word, but affect the rhythm and execution of the entire speech, as, for example, the stammering and stuttering of embarrassment. But here, as in the former cases, it is the inner conflict that is betrayed to us through the disturbance in speech. I really do not believe that anyone will make mistakes in talking in an audience with His Majesty, in a serious love declaration, or in defending one's name and honor before a jury. In short, people make no mistakes when they are all there, as the saying goes. Even in criticizing an author's style, we are allowed and accustomed to follow the principle of explanation, which we cannot miss in the origin of a single speech blunder. A clear and unequivocal manner of writing shows us that here the author is in harmony with himself, but where we find a forced and involved expression aiming at more than one target, as appropriately expressed, we can thereby recognize the participation of an unfinished and complicated thought, or we can hear through it the stifled voice of the author's self-criticism. End of section 5. Chapter 6. Mistakes in Reading and Writing. That the same viewpoints and observation should hold true for mistakes in reading and writing as for lapses in speech is not at all surprising when one remembers the interrelation of these functions. I shall here confine myself to the reports of several carefully analyzed examples, and shall make no attempt to include all of the phenomena. Lapses in reading. A. While looking over a number of Leipziger Illustrierten, which I was holding obliquely, I read, as the title of the front page picture, "A Wedding Celebration in the Odyssey." Astonished, and with my attention aroused, I moved the page into the proper position, only to read correctly, "A Wedding Celebration in the Ostsee," the Baltic Sea. How did this senseless mistake in reading come about? Immediately my thoughts turned to a book by Ruth, Experimental Investigations of Music Phantoms, etc., with which I had recently been much occupied, as it closely touched the psychologic problems that are of interest to me. The author promised a work in the near future to be called Analysis and Principles of Dream Phenomena. No wonder that I, having just published an interpretation of dreams, awaited the appearance of this book with the most intense interest. In Ruth's work concerning music phantoms, I found an announcement in the beginning of the table of contents of the detailed inductive proof that the old Hellenic myths and traditions originated mainly from slumber and music phantoms, from dream phenomena, and from deliria. Thereupon I had immediately plunged into the text in order to find out whether he was also aware that the scene where Odysseus appears before Nausicaa was based upon the common dream of nakedness. One of my friends called my attention to the clever passage in G. Keller's Grunum Heinrich, which explains this episode in the Odyssey as an objective representation of the dream of the mariner straying far from home. I added to it the reference to the exhibition dream of nakedness. B. A woman who is very anxious to get children always reads storks instead of stocks. C. One day I received a letter which contained very disturbing news. I immediately called my wife and informed her that poor Mrs. William H. was seriously ill and was given up by the doctors. There must have been a false ring to the words in which I expressed my sympathy, as my wife grew suspicious, asked to see the letter, and expressed her opinion that it could not read as stated by me, because no one calls the wife by the husband's name. Moreover, the correspondent was well acquainted with the Christian name of the woman concerned. I defended my assertion obstinately, and referred to the customary visiting cards on which a woman designates herself by the Christian name of her husband. I was finally compelled to take up the letter, and as a matter of fact we read therein "Poor W.M." What is more, I had even overlooked "Poor Dr. W.M." My mistake in reading signified a spasmodic effort, so to speak, to turn the sad news from the man towards the woman. The title between the adjective and the name did not go well with my claim that the woman must have been meant. That is why it was omitted in the reading. The motive for this falsifying was not that the woman was less an object of my sympathy than the man, but the fate of this poor man had excited my fears regarding another and nearer person, who, I was aware, had the same disease. D. Both irritating and laughable is a lapse in reading to which I am frequently subject when I walk through the streets of a strange city during my vacation. I then read antiquities on every shop sign that shows the slightest resemblance to the word. This displays the questing spirit of the collector. E. In his important work, Bleuler relates, quote, "While reading, I once had the intellectual feeling of seeing my name 2 lines below. To my astonishment, I found only the words blood corpuscles. Of the many thousands of lapses in reading, in the peripheral as well as in the central field of vision, that I have analyzed, this was the most striking case. Whenever I imagined that I saw my name, the word that induced this illusion usually showed a greater resemblance to my name than to the words blood corpuscles. In most cases, all the letters of my name had to be close together before I could commit such an error. In this case, however, I could readily explain the delusion of reference and the illusion. What I had just read was the end of a statement concerning a form of bad style in scientific works, a tendency from which I am not entirely free." End quote. Lapses in writing. A. On a sheet of paper containing principally short daily notes of business interest, I found to my surprise the incorrect date. Thursday, October 20th, bracketed under the correct date of the month of September. It was not difficult to explain this anticipation as the expression of a wish. A few days before, I had returned fresh from my vacation, and felt ready for any amount of professional work, but as yet there were few patients. On my arrival, I had found a letter from a patient announcing her arrival on the 20th of October. As I wrote the same date in September, I may certainly have thought, X ought to be here already. What a pity about that whole month. And with this thought, I pushed the current date a month ahead. In this case, the disturbing thought can scarcely be called unpleasant. Therefore, after noticing this lapse in writing, I immediately knew the solution. In the fall of the following year, I experienced an entirely analogous and similarly motivated lapse in writing. E. Jones has made a study of similar cases and found that most mistakes in writing dates are motivated. B. I received the proof sheets of my contribution to the annual report on neurology and psychiatry, and I was naturally obliged to review with special care the names of authors which, because of the many different nationalities represented, offer the greatest difficulties to the compositor. As a matter of fact, I found some strange-sounding names still in need of correction. But oddly enough, the compositor had corrected one single name in my manuscript, and with very good reason. I had written Buckerhard, which the compositor guessed to be Burkhard. I had praised the treatise of this obstetrician, entitled The Influence of Birth on the Origin of Infantile Paralysis, and I was not conscious of the least enmity toward him. But an author in Vienna, who had angered me by an adverse criticism of my Traumdeutung, bears the same name. It was as if in writing the name Burkhard, meaning the obstetrician, a wicked thought concerning the other B had obtruded itself. The twisting of the name, as I have already stated in regard to lapses in speech, often signifies a depreciation. C. The following is seemingly a serious case of lapsus calami, which it would be equally correct to describe as an erroneously carried out action. I intended to withdraw from the Postal Savings Bank the sum of 300 crowns, which I wished to send to an absent relative to enable him to take treatment at a watering place. I noted that my account was 4,380 crowns, and I decided to bring it down to the round sum of 4,000 crowns, which was not to be touched in the near future. After making out the regular check, I suddenly noticed that I had written not 380 crowns, as I had intended, but exactly 438 crowns. I was frightened at the untrustworthiness of my action. I soon realized that my fear was groundless, as I had not grown poorer than I was before. But I had to reflect for quite a while in order to discover what influence diverted me from my first intention without making itself known to my consciousness. First, I got on a wrong track. I subtracted 380 from 438, but after that I did not know what to do with the difference. Finally, an idea occurred to me which showed me the true connection. 438 is exactly 10% of the entire account of 4,380 crowns. But the bookseller, too, gives a 10% discount. I recalled that a few days before I had selected several books in which I was no longer interested, in order to offer them to the bookseller for 300 crowns. He thought the price demanded too high, but promised to give me a final answer within the next few days. If he should accept my first offer, he would replace the exact sum that I was to spend on the sufferer. There is no doubt that I was sorry about this expenditure. The emotion at the realization of my mistakes can be more easily understood as a fear of growing poor through such outlays. But both the sorrow over this expense and the fear of poverty connected with it were entirely foreign to my consciousness. I did not regret this expense when I promised the sum, and I would have laughed at the idea of any such underlying motive. I should probably not have assigned such feelings to myself had not my psychoanalytic practice made me quite familiar with the repressed elements of psychic life, and if I had not had a dream a few days before which brought forth the same solution. D. Although it is usually difficult to find the person responsible for a printer's errors, the psychologic mechanisms underlying them are the same as in other mistakes. Typographical errors also well demonstrate the fact that people are not at all indifferent to such trivialities as mistakes, and, judging by the indignant reactions of the parties concerned, one is forced to the conclusion that mistakes are not treated by the public at large as mere accidents. This state of affairs is very well summed up in the following editorial from the New York Times of April 14, 1913. Not the least interesting are the comments of the keen-witted editor, who seems to share our views. Quote, "A blunder truly unfortunate. Typographical errors come only too frequently from even the best regulated newspaper presses. They are always humiliating, often a cause of anger, and occasionally dangerous, but now and then they are distinctly amusing. This latter quality they are most apt to have when they are made in the office of a journalistic neighbor, a fact that probably explains why we can read with smiling composure an elaborate editorial apology which appears in the Hartford Courant. Its able political commentator tried the other day to say, unfortunately for Connecticut, J.H. is no longer a member of Congress. Printer and proofreader combined to deprive the adverb of its negative particle. At least the able political commentator so declares, and we wouldn't question his veracity for the world. But sorrowful experience has taught most of us that it's safer to get that sort of editorial disclaimer of responsibility into print before looking up the copy. And perhaps, just perhaps, the world enlightener who knows that he wrote unfortunate, because that is what he intended to write, didn't rashly change the discovery of his own guilt before he convicted the composing room of it. Be that as it may, the meaning of the sentence was cruelly changed, and a friend was grieved or offended. Not so long ago, a more astonishing error than this one crept into a book review of ours, a very solemn and scientific book. It consisted of the substitution of the word caribou for the word carbon in a paragraph dealing with the chemical composition of the stars. In this case, the writer's fierce self-exculpation is at least highly plausible, as it seems hardly possible that he wrote caribou when he intended to write carbon, but even he was cautious enough to make no deep inquiry into the matter." End quote. E. I cite the following case contributed by Dr. W. Steckel, for the authenticity of which I can vouch. Quote, "An almost unbelievable example of miswriting and misreading occurred in the editing of a widely circulated weekly. It concerned an article of defense and vindication which was written with much warmth and great pathos. The editor-in-chief of the paper read the article, while the author himself naturally read it from the manuscript and proof sheets more than once. Everybody was satisfied when the printer's readers suddenly noticed a slight error which had escaped the attention of all. There it was, plainly enough. Our readers will bear witness to the fact that we have always acted in a selfish manner for the good of the community. It is quite evident that it was meant to read unselfish. The real thoughts, however, broke through the pathetic speech with elemental force." End quote. F. The following example of misprinting is taken from a Western Gazette. The teacher was giving an instruction paper on mathematical methods, and spoke of a plan for the instruction of youth that might be carried out ad libidinem. G. Even the Bible did not escape misprints. Thus we have the wicked Bible, so called from the fact that the negative was left out of the seventh commandment. This authorized edition of the Bible was published in London in 1631, and it is said that the printer had to pay a fine of £2,000 for the omission. Another biblical misprint dates back to the year 1580, and is found in the Bible of the famous library of Wolfenbüttel in Hesse. In the passage in Genesis where God tells Eve that Adam shall be her master and shall rule over her, the German translation is "Under soll dein Herr sein." The word Herr, master, was substituted by Narr, which means fool. Newly discovered evidence seems to show that the error was a conscious machination of the printer's suffragette wife, who refused to be ruled by her husband. H. Dr. Ernest Jones reports the following case concerning A. Brill. Quote, "Although by custom almost a teetotaler, he yielded to a friend's importunity one evening, in order to avoid offending him, and took a little wine. During the next morning an exacerbation of an eye-strain headache gave him cause to regret this slight indulgence, and his reflection on the subject found expression in the following slip of the pen. Having occasion to write the name of a girl mentioned by a patient, he wrote not Ethel, Ethel, but Ethel, Ethyl. It happened that the girl in question was rather too fond of drink, and in Dr. Brill's mood at the time this characteristic of hers stood out with conspicuous significance. I. A woman wrote to her sister, felicitating her on the occasion of taking possession of a new and spacious residence. A friend who was present noticed that the writer put the wrong address on the letter, and what was still more remarkable was the fact that she did not address it to the previous residence, but to one long ago given up, but which her sister had occupied when she first married. When the friend called her attention to it, the writer remarked, "You are right, but what in the world made me do this?" To which her friend replied, "Perhaps you begrudge her the nice big apartment into which she has just moved, because you yourself are cramped for space, and for that reason you put her back in her first residence, where she was no better off than yourself." "Of course I begrudge her the new apartment," she honestly admitted. As an afterthought she added, "It is a pity that one is so mean in such matters." K. Ernest Jones reports the following example given to him by Dr. A. Brill. In a letter to Dr. Brill, a patient tried to attribute his nervousness to business worries and excitement during the cotton crisis. He went on to say, quote, "My trouble is all due to that frigid wave. There isn't even any seed to be obtained for new crops." End quote. He referred to a cold wave which had destroyed the cotton crops, but instead of writing wave, he wrote wife. In the bottom of his heart he entertained reproaches against his wife on account of her marital frigidity and childlessness, and he was not far from the cognition that the enforced abstinence played no little part in the causation of his malady. Omissions in writing are naturally explained in the same manner as mistakes in writing. A remarkable example of omission, which is of historic importance, was reported by Dr. B. Dattner. In one of the legal articles dealing with the financial obligations of both countries, which was drawn up in the year 1867 during the readjustment between Austria and Hungary, the word effective was accidentally omitted in the Hungarian translation. Dattner thinks it probable that the unconscious desire of the Hungarian lawmakers to grant Austria the least possible advantages had something to do with this omission. Another example of omission is the following, related by Brill. Quote, "A prospective patient who had corresponded with me relative to treatment finally wrote for an appointment for a certain day. Instead of keeping his appointment he sent regrets, which began as follows: Owing to foreseen circumstances, I am unable to keep my appointment. He naturally meant to write unforeseen. He finally came to me months later, and in the course of the analysis I discovered that my suspicions at the time were justified. There were no unforeseen circumstances to prevent his coming at that time. He was advised not to come to me. The unconscious does not lie." Wundt gives a most noteworthy proof for the easily ascertained fact that we more easily make mistakes in writing than in speaking. He states, "In the course of normal conversation, the inhibiting function of the will is constantly directed toward bringing into harmony the course of ideation with the movement of articulation. If the articulation following the ideas becomes retarded through mechanical causes, as in writing, anticipations then readily make their appearance." Observation of the determinants which favor lapses in reading gives rise to doubt, which I do not like to leave unmentioned, because I am of the opinion that it may become the starting point of a fruitless investigation. It is a familiar fact that in reading aloud the attention of the reader often wanders from the text and is directed toward his own thoughts. The results of this deviation of attention are often such that when interrupted and questioned he cannot even state what he was reading. In other words, he has read automatically, although the reading was nearly always correct. I do not think that such conditions favor any noticeable increase in the mistakes. We are accustomed to assume concerning a whole series of functions that they are most precisely performed when done automatically, with scarcely any conscious attention. This argues that the conditions governing attention in mistakes in speaking, writing, and reading must be differently determined than assumed by Wundt, cessation or diminution of attention. The examples which we have subjected to analysis have really not given us the right to take for granted a quantitative diminution of attention. We found what is probably not exactly the same thing, a disturbance of the attention through a strange obtruding thought. End of section 6.